And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas room tonight. Of course, I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, it looks like that Davos crowd is winding down with all their exciting pronouncements for humanity's future. And everybody just standing at attention.
It was a tense week.
I think the arrogance on display there and the kind of insanity that we saw just in abundance over the top. And cited for special mention is Al Gore, who had the best freak out. He gets the award for flipping out. Everyone has to do something. Take those carbon credits and don't take any of his billions, please. Because after all, he did give the election to George Bush in 2000. Tonight we have something special for you. This is X Series 144, and we are going deep, deep into the mystery schools, and it is the mystery school presidents. Now, not every president comes out of a mystery school, and there are higher and lower degrees in relation to this. But in those flashpoints, it becomes very interesting to track back which mystery school has put this candidate forward and what is the clash over putting that particular candidate in, including a few presidents who didn't get in, which are always intriguing along that line. But there is an immense occult, esoteric crisscross going on in the background in relation to every presidency of the United States. And of course, the presidency of the United States being founded by mystery schools of the right-hand level, seeking to move the culture forward from a very repressive king over there in England. But soon enough, co-opting influences, adopting right into the founding fathers, and trying to stretch their hand all the way from Europe through. So it gets quite interesting to see what the mystery schools, mystery lodges, black lodges, and white lodges had in mind and how that story is playing out. And for my money, it is, in fact, the most important story going on in the background if we want to understand anything about these types of politics. We're going to tackle it tonight through the figures of Ronald Reagan and the figures of FDR, Harry Truman, Woodrow Wilson, and the very deep hand of the mystery schools behind all of them, Abraham Lincoln, as well as a few players who would have been president, like, you ready? Burton Wheeler.
Burton Wheeler?
Senator from Montana. I'm going to tell you how he would have been a mystery school president.
Okay.
And, of course, Henry Wallace, very important in this sense, which is that Wallace represents the big step of the mystery schools, putting forth a candidate to run things, and him missing it just by so much with the trickery of the group behind Harry Truman. So this all comes in that FDR era, and it leads us into the JFK period, and it leads us into really some of the high marks of the presidencies, which is JFK and FDR and Reagan. But when we get into the Bushes and Clintons and Bush again and Obama, we're in the tank for sure. But there's lots and lots of esoteric connections, school connections going on with that. By the time we arrive back at Trump, we're in the middle again of very, very deep influences. I put forward on this show in an episode called Mystery School Politics, all about Steve Bannon and his Gurdjieff connection, which is very, very interesting because that's the fourth way school sort of coming into the picture. And mostly what you see in relation to this is Rosicrucian or Masonic or Theosophical influences, and some Golden Dawn in there for good measure. So when you see the fourth way, you particularly pay attention. And there's a lot of fourth way around President Trump, oddly enough. And Stepford Biden, I think he was just bought in a long time ago. Not a whole lot there. He's just controlled, but that group that controls him have very, very deep connections to this whole occult world. So in fact, that whole game is playing out. And once we get to November of 2024, you're going to be looking at a direct clash of mystery schools and secret societies behind the scenes once again. So we're, it's just not something that we can get away from. One of the things I want to point out in relation to the presidents, though, is that there was a cycle that was going on that every 20th year, when we get to, since Abraham Lincoln, when we get to that next president, so 1880, 1900, 1920, 1940, 1960, the guy who was in office would die. And multiple times that was by assassination in the case of McKinley and Garfield and President Kennedy. But it was going to be true in the case of Ronald Reagan. So Reagan upset this pattern that was set in there. And I'm going to kind of start off with Reagan, because there's so many strange things, and I'm going to bring a little fun into it, Olivia. If you remember a show called The Greatest American Hero.
From the 80s.
From the 80s. This is an 80s TV show, and it was all about aliens messing with a teacher and making him join a covert group. But there's something very interesting about some correlations around that show and what took place in relation to Reagan's assassination. So we're going to go deep on that tonight. I also want to remind everyone, if you haven't already, to sign up for our free newsletter that keeps us in touch. We've been under massive, and I mean massive, censorship, especially lately. And I've had people I know from the tech industry look into that very oppressive censorship that goes on. And we are being really, as they say, de-amplified. So we're working with that right now. And in any case, we carry on and do what we do. But the best way for us all to stay in touch is that newsletter. And what the newsletter does is it lets you know what incredible shows that we have coming up for you here in 2023 for January, February, March. Just an incredible year coming up for you with very special, amazing interviews, X-Series episodes. And of course, we're going to do the 5-year anniversary of the X-Series in March. And so we'll do a special 2-parter for that. And so that should keep us covered. But yes, the newsletter, darkjournalist.com. The other thing I want to remind you is that in the second half of the program tonight, and we're going to go a couple hours tonight, in the second half of the program, we will be taking your questions. So you can ask those now. Miss Olivia will put those together. And Miss Olivia, how is the temperature out there?
Great. I wanted to start with this. Amarillo Gunrunners says, did anyone else check out Tucker Carlson last night? It sounded like an excerpt from one of DJ's recent shows. Not sure how we're going to handle it when the truth becomes mainstream.
Isn't this interesting? And I've been pointing this out, that they are more and more pulling these threads into the mainstream. And of course, I always celebrate it when the information gets out. For me, I think it's very important to see it coming forward, but we have to know that with the things we've been doing in the X series and the ideas from the back and forth that we have here, gives us that almost crystal ball into the future. We're watching the patterns, so we're many years ahead of what's taking place, interestingly enough. And the thing that I've said, the only reservation I have about some of this stuff coming out in a more clickbaity type way is that the potency potentially gets lost. So you have to watch this year. One of the big kind of key things that I've put out there is that you're going to watch shows that have potency. So, when we get general shows doing fluff pieces on the UFO file, or inviting CIA people to tell us about the UFO file, that's not very helpful, in fact. But I think this kind of tide is turning on the information that they can't keep certain things. So they're going to try to sort of co-opt the narratives. But first, the narratives start breaking through. And but that is interesting. I've seen a lot of this, and we've seen it on major networks in independent circles. That kind of redoubling effect and the quake, the vibration from the deep topics. And we all want to get on the deep page this year. I think it's very important to do that pre the insane 2024 election year, because there's so many things at stake with the biometric surveillance that's going on, with what they're trying to do to make the central bank digital currency, the CBDC, just a given. It's inevitable. It's going to happen because they're going to force it. No, we don't have to agree to that as a currency. And maybe, interestingly enough, our major allies in that can be the people who have signed on for Bitcoin or something like that and don't want this other thing to compete with them. But in any case, the digital banking becomes a major piece of those kind of prison bars that they want, the digital prison bars they want to put around us. And those efforts discussed deeply, along with efforts to curb free speech that we've seen. There have been a lot of bright spots as well, though I have to say the resignation of Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. Bravo, New Zealand, because Ardern really was one of the worst in terms of just the glee that she had in dishing out really fascist mandates in a democratic country. And the fact that they have her out of there, they're aware that the backlash that they're facing is another populism role like what they had in 2016, and they are making moves to make sure that doesn't happen. One of those moves is getting rid of Stepford Biden.
Obviously.
Speaking of presidents, not. But it is interesting because Biden finds himself in the crosshairs of CNN and, stations like that. I mean, think about this. So really his fortunes are changing rather dramatically as we speak. And all around the same thing that, I think that group is signaling that they're upset with the overreach that was done at Mar-a-Lago and what it related to and raiding an ex-president. So they gave him the same exact problem as an excuse in helping to remove him, because Biden is gearing up to announce his, he's going to run again. And they don't want that. They actually want him to pass the ball to either Gavin Newsom or one of these others. Gretchen Whitmer, they're actually trying to stage, which
it's hard to believe. Sometimes when someone so clearly isn't presidential material,
yes,
it just looks like a money laundering operation.
Oh, that's really true. Well, the other thing about her, they want a woman in there, and they don't have a really good field of women in the Democratic Party. So, they're trying to see what can we work with, who's been loyal. And, with all the they've been trying to do a lot of things to pump up her profile. I've noticed that. I've noticed the Gavin Newsom thing. He's, of course, the guy who said he was going to call martial law against his own citizens if they didn't, respond to those lockdown orders coming from, I'll hold the term, Mr. Newsom. But for me, when I look at that stuff, I see that they're positioning to try to do something to jettison, because I think that they think they're the Titanic going down with Stepford Biden, who, after all, is like Ardern, does not have enough of a base to govern. And remember, these people can only govern with emergency powers, which is why we've brought in so many of the shows dealing with emergency actions, the continuity of government actions. Something to watch for, I'd say, in 2023 is, some of this idea of a cyber structure, cyber attack that they can blame on Russia and things of this nature. This is the kind of emergency powers play, I think, that we can see coming up. All right, everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Here we are in X Series 144. I'm going to take you into the mystery school presidents, and we'll have a little fun along the way as well. Anything else over there?
11T Levity says, do you think they're saving Jacinda for a global position? I'm going to answer this. I don't think so, because she was very upset. Like, she didn't want to step down from this position. So if she was going to some better position, if she was graduating, I don't think she would have been so emotional. Feels
to me like when you're that young, and
I know it's so hard. How old is she?
I think she's 44 years old.
That's crazy.
It's absurd. So, but when we think about this, if you're leading a country and you bail out of, running for re-election, there's a problem there. And for me, they're doing this on a number of levels to prevent that wave of populism from coming up and taking over everything. And they have a Trump problem as well, which they're working on very much for 2024. And they're hoping to position people to the right of Trump and Right now, Trump, they did some recent polls where Trump was head to head against DeSantis and trounced him by 26 points or something. So for me, right now, the man to beat is Trump in relation to 2024. That could change fast, though. We know it's all hands on deck in relation to keeping Trump out. Are there going to be new options? Are we going to have better options? There's going to be a lot that plays out in the first 6 months of this year that'll give us some of those answers. Let's take it back in time. Today's January 20th, 2023. What was going on January 20th of 1941? Some 82 years ago.
Okay.
It was the official inauguration of FDR and Henry Wallace. And both of these men were very, very deep. Roosevelt, including not only the Masons and the Oddfellows, which is a very interesting kind of spin-off of the Masons and unusual for a lot of reasons. Very heavy emphasis on youth. But also, when we look at Henry Wallace, we are looking at the X piece coming in, a direct major theosophist, but somebody who was such a core member that they were part of the Halcyon Temple, which is the theosophical group that broke away from the Besant Theosophical Society and really started their own thing in California. This is an important group. I highlighted them in an episode. This has been a couple of years now, but the whole story of the Halcyon Temple is in a wonderful book called Radiance from Halcyon, and that's Halcyon by Paul Eli Ivy, A Utopian Experiment of Religion and Science. I'm going to read a few quotes from this book tonight, but one of the things that we can say about Halcyon is it had some major theosophical figures and members, and it was heavy on the artistic side, and it had the master Hilarion as its kind of main deity overseeing proceedings, which gave it a heavy emphasis around arts and sciences. But the scientific ray that Hilarion had with him in theosophical terms gives us the very, very deep scientific edge. And what happens is when we come out of that group, we see the Varian brothers, who will be the literal foundation of Silicon Valley. And these guys are going to move deeply into the whole picture of developing, the very early CERN experiments. So the Varian brothers, I've highlighted them in relation to the fact that they grew up in this Halcyon community. And Halcyon has one very interesting member there in Vice President Henry Wallace, who was going to become the 33rd president after being the 33rd vice president. And that is someone who was a Mason, but stepped from Masonic duties into the Theosophical Society and brought forward so much influence on FDR that we're going to see a whole occult puzzle piece fall into place with FDR. But by the time we get to 1945, he has been booted out of the vice presidency. He was going to be there and he was going to be President-X. But instead, we got Truman, who would drop the bomb. And this is something that it's pretty clear Wallace was not going to do. So these groups behind the scenes had to move this in just right. And so a lot of things were done to remove Wallace from the entire picture. But in the meantime, over the course of, a number of years with FDR, including also as his Secretary of Agriculture, this is somebody who was deep, and he started off as a Republican, interestingly enough, but he became a Democrat, and he became eventually to become a leading independent candidate against the whole thing. And then he ends his, at the end of his life there, it's when JFK is getting in, and JFK says, hey, any cabinet position, you name it, because that's how much I admire you. So here we have Kennedy in the Wallace thing. So the Wallace thing stretching out FDR through the battles to get into the presidency with Truman, and then by the time you get to the JFK presidency, he's invited in complete. So it's a very interesting background, I think, when we're getting there. A few things about Wallace, which is that he was a popular vice president because he had come from a farming background. So there was, major emphasis on farming during the Depression. And this is somebody who was a heavy idealist. He was leaned on the pacifist side. And also he was somebody who really could make FDR look good, he could be the guy who was really dynamic and high energy, while FDR was giving those speeches, dedicated speeches in Washington, D.C., but because of his own physical ailments, couldn't really get around as much. So you really had Wallace as an excellent foil for FDR. But behind the scenes, they had an interesting secret, which is they were both deep, deep, deep into the occult and the esoteric strains. We're going to get into some of that here. I have just some irresistible images. This one has to be one of the most uncomfortable car scenes I've ever seen in my life. Excuse me. It is FDR, Truman, and Henry Wallace after Truman is replacing Wallace as VP. That's quite a shot. I think it says a little bit of everything. But what we're getting is that Truman, again, is thrust into this position. And when he gets in there, he cannot believe, as VP, how much he's cut out of the loop. FDR is not dealing with him at all. And so FDR dies very suddenly on April 12th into his fourth term. And so Truman's only been vice president for 3 months. And he has to take over everything. And they say, guess what? We've been working on this atomic bomb. Didn't know anything about it. So we have an interesting presence immediately with Harry Truman, because if you go back even a half-inch deep with Truman, you have all kinds of unusual signatures there. You have Masonic signatures. You have the UFO file right off the bat. And then you have the person who creates the actual national security state. So it's quite interesting. He was under heavy pressure. And if you go back and look at that career, it's quite something, because he was a haberdasher. This guy ran a clothing store, and he never got past high school. In fact, there's some remarkable people that we're going to look at tonight who did not get past high school, including Manly P. Hall. But he's got the early mystery influence, and he has a major support system in that Kansas City, Missouri machine, and its sway over so much of the politics going on. Kansas City and St. Louis made Missouri a true powerhouse, but something that happens there in 1941 is the Cape Girardeau UFO crash. And this will require that heavy level of Masonic secrecy, which, basically will give Truman that seal of approval to make him the ideal candidate for vice president, who they know is going to be president. Because FDR is quite remarkable in his abilities of hiding his illness, but he's actually quite ill for a good 6 or 7 years before he dies. And he gets amazing things done. He gets the whole New Deal going on, and he has to manage World War II after getting us out of the Depression. So, Roosevelt's a very interesting character. He's a mixed character for sure, but there are some things there to admire. There's also a number of unanswered questions about him. One of the interesting stories comes to us out of the Gurdjieff work, which is that there are a number of people at the priory there in France, and they remember somebody coming in the late 1920s who was a very high-level American politician. And at that time, FDR would have been governor of New York and planning to run for president. Wasn't president yet. But because of these debilitating physical illnesses that he'd done a number of things with holistic groups and other things, natural healing. And somewhere along the line, he heard of Gurdjieff. So here's another very interesting Gurdjieff connection with FDR. Of course, in the Gurdjieff story, there's also Crowley who goes to visit the priory, and that story ends a little bit differently because Gurdjieff throws him out. Interestingly enough, what do you got over there?
David Donaway says Harry S. Truman, Alfalfa Club, Treat Club, Fraternal Order of Eagles, Benevolent and Protective Order of the Elks, Freemasonry, Belton Lodge, Missouri Knights Templar, Loyal Order of Moose.
He's such a remarkable insider, and in fact, he's picked out to be a judge. And like I said, he didn't have any experience or background, but in 1922, they're like, "You're a judge." And there's a whole piece there with Truman. We got a lot of presidents to get through tonight, but I think this segment is going to be really quite fascinating. Whenever we get around Wallace, Truman, and FDR, you've got that very, very deep, the mystery schools are standing up and paying attention and trying at this pivotal point for humanity to break things through. When we look back at that 1940 election, going back 83 years, and then the inauguration 82 years ago, and you think of the things that they were facing going in, it's just absolutely incredible. And the election ends in 1940, without the whole piece about Pearl Harbor and all the rest of it. So there's a big isolationist thing. We're not getting into this war. And, we got into World War I. It didn't do us any good. And, let's stay out of it, basically. So there's a huge isolationist wing. And the people that are around in the middle of all this, like Charles Lindbergh, for example, the mystery school signatures are so hardcore that we just have this incredible peak moment there. And I think that, we have something that looks like a major battle between the mystery schools. And one of the things the mystery schools at this period get done is one of their main people, Gandhi, allows and gets for India to have self-rule. And that's something that they've been working on, since the 1870s in the mystery schools. So that's a major kind of push that is accomplished. And there's so many layers that get laid down. Now, Wallace is interesting. Basically, I've introduced you to Wallace as somebody who is the Secretary of Agriculture who becomes VP, but he's a major progressive thinker. He's somebody who's thinking about how the whole country can benefit. And at the time, we have a major, heavy duty push that's going on, which is super capitalism and all the rest. And we saw where that all ended with the Depression. So when these people are putting things back together, to have a farmer in there is quite remarkable. One of the things that he does is he creates a hybrid kind of corn which can grow anywhere. And this is interesting too, because it makes him very wealthy. I'm going to read a little bit about some of the background, and then we're going to bring in Nicholas Roerich, who was one of these very interesting esoteric mystery school players who shows up on the scene. He's an artist. He's a politician. He's a diplomat. Like, well, here's another five different identities in one person. But he's so important. He becomes the liaison directly between FDR and Wallace. And so there's a very interesting back and forth where he's feeding this information that goes from Wallace directly to FDR. Now we're going to see the same loop in Edgar Cayce in relation to Woodrow Wilson. That's coming up shortly. And then we're going to watch the same loop with Gene Dixon and Manly P. Hall play out with Reagan and Nixon. This is interesting. There's a point where Wallace is so fed up with what they did to him that what happens is, I'll just give you a little background on this. FDR, who's had him now as vice president for already for 8 years, he expects to continue to be vice president and then move on from there. But what happens, oddly enough, is at the last minute, even though he has incredible momentum, there are a number of weird moves, kind of dirty tricks that are played at the convention, including pretending there's going to be a fire and things of this nature. And then they work in the background. That machine that's behind Truman works in the background, and he becomes the VP. What they do is they make our friend Wallace the Commerce Secretary. So he still has a great position, but as soon as FDR dies, bang, Truman fires him. So he's really out there in the woods. And, he's been this ultimate inside track. He's worked for a mystery school, bringing everything directly to Truman. And now we've dropped the bomb. He's not president and all the rest of it. So what does he do when he gets fired by Truman as Commerce Secretary? He decides, I'm going to run independent against you. And he does. And this is a very interesting running to the left of Truman on a number of issues and being like, you're not going for a very fair, America. And what's interesting is this will give a great advantage to Thomas Dewey, who's for sure going to win, but then Strom Thurmond, who becomes very deeply enmeshed in the UFO file, he is someone who's running independently also. So he gets a nice chunk of the independent vote, strips it away from Dewey, and that's how Truman sneaks through with double opposition going on. So Truman was going to be out, but somebody up there liked him on this. So what happens is in the middle of all this, while he's running against Truman in 1948 now, there are a number of hit jobs in the media that are going on connecting him with Nicholas Roerich. And Roerich, as I said, is this very unusual Russian artist, diplomat, writer, philosopher, a little bit of everything. But it comes out that Wallace has been writing him a series of letters, or he wrote them in the 30s, and they call them the Guru letters. And Wallace writes them in code and says, like, I have given all the information that you gave me to the Fox, and the Fox is sure to get back to you, And so he has all these people in government that he nicknames them different animals, and that's how he has this information feeding back to Roerich. Well, the State Department doesn't like this, one, because Roerich is a Russian, but also, it's easy now that the letters are there for them to come out and embarrass him. So they do come out. Now, it's interesting. These are some of the kind of hit jobs going on in the media at that time, but they're very telling. Check this out. Roerich was a very peculiar person with commanding eyes, a forked beard, and mystical vocabulary. He wrote book after book that made sense to his worshippers, but nobody else. The Roerich cult flourished in many countries, leaving Russia after the First World War. He lived in the U.S. a while, then established his sacred abode in India, sometimes visited here. Henry Wallace's contacts with Roerich grew out of his long interest in occult dogmas, mostly drawn from Asia. He has studied numerology, Zoroastrianism, etc. One of his assistants in the Department of Agriculture once said, "I don't dare let a theosophist in to see Henry. He'd give him a job right away. I have to be careful or the place will be overrun with theosophists." Think about that. So, this is somebody who's wearing then his mystery school badge on his sleeve. So what happens is in that 30s period as the Secretary of Agriculture, he convinces FDR to have Roerich and his little band of followers go to Mongolia, supposedly to find a seed that is resistant to dehydration. And that's a weird cover for this Shambhala experiment. And so the idea is he's going into Central Asia to visit this mystery school to come back and give Wallace and FDR some deep direction on how to steer America. And there are notes back and forth where Wallace has said, saying to FDR, hey, the master is going to give us these special messages. So already we're surrounded now by Wallace and his theosophical teachings deep there, and he's getting positioned to be president. FDR is positioning him to take his knowledge and wisdom and all the clout that he has and become president when he leaves it. But hanging out there with those mighty ties of masonry is our friend Harry Truman. And again, Truman, his very special sort of signature thing that happens before he's thrust into the presidency is he handles Cape Girardeau using Masonic deep secrecy. The Cape Girardeau UFO case should have broken wide open and been the first. Before Roswell, it's actually 1941. And it's got the signature of a classic disc crash with bodies there, and then they have fire trucks. And if you go back into the story now, there's been a couple of interesting additions. I did a show with Linda Moulton Howe on it. How long ago was that? 2017,
Wow.
I think. And Linda had it all down. But the relatives, the daughters of the people who had encountered this, the fire chief who said, we thought it was a plane crash. And then we got there and there's a number of aliens and a crashed disc, very similar to the Roswell story. The person who had to lock that down, and they sealed whatever it was that they recovered there in Washington. Truman was in charge of the entire operation, and he was the senator from Missouri at the time. Now, and a lot of very, very interesting things there in Missouri. So we can see how he instantly has this kind of edge, even though Wallace is set up very close to FDR. Here's a bit about Wallace from people who were in Theosophy, giving us the lowdown on this. So he's raised Presbyterian. He gets very, very deep into agriculture because his own father is, very deep with this whole farming move. And he edits an agricultural journal. George William Russell, who's known as AE, and we've included him in broadcasts before. He was a theosophical artist who could go up on the astral plane and snapshot people's past lives and things. And he did this remarkable portrait of Blavatsky as a warrior. But he
What's
also...
this guy's name?
It's AE, which is
okay.
interesting because AE comes up as one of the names of Elon Musk's kids.
Mhm.
But this is what he has to say about Wallace. All manner of esoteric phenomena fascinated him. Seances, symbols, secret societies, rituals, astrology, Native American religion, Oriental philosophy. In the realm of the mystical, little escaped his curiosity. As early as 1919, he attended a meeting of the Theosophical Society at the Des Moines Lodge, and then he becomes a card-carrying member of the American Theosophical Society in the 20s. It's very interesting because what happens through Russell is that he meets Roerich. And I want to do just a quick thing on Roerich so we know who we're dealing with. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're deep here in X series 144. This is the Mystery School Presidents. What makes a mystery? What makes him esoteric? Well, we're going to show you tonight. There is Roerich and his wife. His wife, Helena, will be the one who translates the Blavatsky book, The Secret Doctrine, into Russian. That's a pretty heavy-duty task. And so the Theosophical Society trusts her very, very deeply.
I'm going to throw something in here.
Yes.
I'm Not Dead Yet says, I've heard that Helena Roerich was a messenger for the Great White Brotherhood. She was a genius. She taught herself to read using the Door Bible when she was 5.
She is very, very interesting. They're both very unusual. It's hard to say, exactly what was going on there. They also have one of the earliest UFO encounters in 1929 and write about it. And I have the quotation here. But Roerich, I think, is interesting because he's also associated with Nijinsky. And there's a thread of mystery teaching like eurythmy, like the Gurdjieff movements, and these other things, which work directly through the arts. And so they bypass all of the technical teaching, and they go directly into something where people learn certain moves and they learn certain designs and theatrical presentations, and that becomes the teaching. I want to say this about mystery schools. Not all the teachings are, lecture oriented. So many of them will involve sometimes movement. If you look at the later periods of people like Gurdjieff, you're going to see the art of living as the teaching. So people are looking, they're showing up and being like, waiting for crumbs from the master's table for these different teachers. And in fact, the way that they're living is the instruction. It's the pattern. And this goes deep into like a Gnostic Christianity as well, where you're not just living by the doctrine, but you're observing, and it's the art of what they're doing. And so, for example, the Last Supper is the art of living. It has a little bit of that. So it's not the Sermon on the Mount by a long shot. It's something very different. It is the sharing of an event. So we have to look for how the teaching shows up depending on the culture in the different ways that's required. Right now, we need something as a great defense against the onslaught of the technocracy and the kind of fascist technological takeover. So that's the era that we're in. So the way that mystery knowledge comes up is going to be somehow related to that. But if we were in, Nazarene times back there when Jesus showed up, the teaching is totally suited to the times, but the pattern is very universal and reanimates itself in all kinds of different forms. So this is something important to keep in mind. The other thing I want to mention too is when we get around mystery school teachings, we have to understand that there is a kind of, when things get around in society, there's a sort of a marketing banter around a term like esoteric or mystery school. So we're speaking on the deepest possible level. And I've described how the levels work when it comes to mystery schools. You have, kind of the public versions of the mystery schools. Then you have private study groups around those public groups. And then when you go deeper, you have lesser degree schools. They call them lesser schools. It's such an interesting, humble title because they know so much. And then you have the main core of the mystery teaching, the esoteric kind of inner circle of the whole thing. And I think one way that Gurdjieff described it is when these esoteric ideas get out into the regular world, they become exoteric, and so they respond more mechanically. And so, terms and things that we can use, like mystery school, sound a lot different inside the school than they will just in the general run of things. And it's why they say that a lot of the main teachings haven't been put down in books. The way to think of it, I would say, whenever you get around mystery teachings, is that there is something that is a magnetic center in everyone who's attracted to these ideas. And so the magnetic center is the thing that you build through book knowledge, through lectures, and things of this nature, and through art and other sources. So that magnetic center is core. You don't need to be in a mystery school to develop that kind of mystery knowledge. And I think that's what's so important. When you get around groups like Masonic groups, or you get, things that are involved with the esoteric imagery, then what you realize is that when you have group activity, it amplifies the signal to noise ratio that you're engaging with. So that's the way to think about groups, I would say. And a lot of, I do get a lot of email about people saying, which mystery school do you recommend? And what I recommend is study, really, and, the things that you resonate with. The public mystery schools that have come up, the dramatic pieces happened mostly in the 19th and 20th century, and then they are leveling into the 21st century and reanimating. So what they do is, and Bennett, who is a student of Gurdjieff's, described it this way, that they come up for a certain period from these inner schools, and then they spread seeds in a number of different ways. You can look at periods like the 60s and 70s very much like this, and then they retreat back and see what happens with what they've planted out there. And then you get another cycle like that. And then you get these long, steady periods where it seems, people are just imitating what took place before. So when we look at these key periods, we're looking at, for example, 1875, when Blavatsky shows up on the scene and completely explodes, everything that's going on there, and creates a public esoteric dimension, which just wasn't there. And then you have others taking that over and bringing it to a certain point, but it becomes, like a lot of things, it loses its initial luster. And then it is the anthroposophical movement through Steiner, who started with theosophy, that brings it to a whole other level. And that level continues even if you look at the number of things that Steiner did, whether it's farming or eurythmia, whatever it happens to be, that level is with us. That is an ever increasing pattern. So we start to use these things, and we can look at them operating in different ages, and maybe get a feel for how these groups influence and move the culture. But it's not, they don't come in and rule the culture. They're trying to move the culture. Those are the right-hand schools. The left-hand schools are, power at any price type schools. And so we start to recognize them in the political process, probably the easiest. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here. This is X Series 144, going deep tonight on the mystery school presidents. And we have some unknown people who were almost president to show you in relation to this as well. There's a lot more to say about Rorik and Helena, his wife, but I want to keep rolling. And this is actually one of the very interesting paintings he did that made a large impression on FDR. And this is kind of Princess of Peace image. And you find a lot of this is related to peace. And it's funny because there's almost like a mystery school trend for FDR to have this, so that when the pressures for war come up, he'll at least have some options back there and he won't be, kind of caught up in it. And what happens is America gets plunged into the war, just like Europe and everywhere else. Here is the actual account. And this is something that Rorik's wife recorded, and she suggests the existence of life on other planets in this report. August 5th, 1929, something remarkable. We were in our camp in the Kukanor district, not far from Humboldt Chain, wherever that is. In the morning, about 9:30, some of our caravanners noticed a remarkably big black eagle flying over us. 7 of us began to watch this unusual bird. At the same moment, another of our caravanners remarked, "There is something far above the bird I can see." And he shouted in his astonishment. We all saw in a direction from north to south something big and shiny reflecting the sun, like a huge oval moving at a great speed. Crossing our camp, the thing changed in its direction from south to southwest, and we saw how it disappeared in the intense blue sky. We even had time to take our field glasses and saw quite distinctly an oval form with shiny surface, one side of which was brilliant from the sun. Now, that's Nicholas Rorik, and Rorik's wife, who was on the expedition. In her diary, she comments that this must have been a craft with people from somewhere else. That's pretty advanced. That's for 1929. I mean, think about this. You're going to find the UFO file intermingling anywhere time we get around the mysticism involving the political positions. The UFO file shows up as well. There it is, right in the middle of the Rorik expedition. It shows up with Harry Truman, of course, and there's a meeting that takes place with FDR and the Prime Minister of the UK where they discuss it. And Churchill says something to the effect of, we have to just really hammer down heavy on the secrecy. We need a real tight program around this. And there were actually bodyguards and people that came forward around that. Now, if we go back a little bit before this era, we're going to find that there's a heavy duty mystery school influence around World War I involving Woodrow Wilson. And he's the next president that we're going to tackle. Before I do, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay, so where do I go from here? Ray Story says, would you call this a Theosophical Rebel Alliance group?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because it shows up predominantly as theosophical in the way that it comes over to America. And I think the foundation is there. When Blavatsky comes over here, and she hooks up with Henry Olcott. And Olcott, the two of them develop the Theosophical Society in 1875. But Olcott is deep in politics. And there's the President Lincoln link, because he is Colonel Olcott. And after all, after the Lincoln assassination, he's called in. And he becomes a member of basically what was the Warren Commission of the era, like what took place in this assassination, who was involved. So that's where he's at. And then he's writing then in the New York Times in the 1870s about seances and things going on at the Eddy House in Vermont, and that people are getting together and watching this large scale activity. If you go into the Lincoln era, there's a heavy dose of spiritualism happening. And that is, people observing table rapping and, all kinds of phenomena and people coming through, dead people coming through. And there's this whole explosion. And this is all engineered by different sides of the mystery schools trying to get some sort of balance going on, because what happens is in the story, the way that Steiner tells it, around 1841, there's a piece of the mystery schools. There's a group inside that just looks out and says humanity is going to suffer dramatically from scientific materialism to such a degree that they'll be cut off from their spirituality. We need to do something. And almost against the orders of the others, come out and do weird things like, the Fox sisters and all these types of very interesting things that happen. And I think that the people who are involved are quite interesting. I had a picture of the Fox sisters handy, but their story is quite fascinating. And what's interesting is when I've done shows on the Orphic Circle, which involve Emma Britton, who as a teenager was used as a clairvoyant by these groups that included, the English Prime Minister and Charles Dickens and, all of that piece that she identified there. When she goes, and that's all in the UK, when she goes from the UK and is, sent by her handlers basically to be part of this theater troupe, and they don't need her clairvoyant services anymore, she comes to America and she's in New York and she's walking around and the psychic activity is, increasing, and she's seeing all of these different spiritualists everywhere. And she sees the Fox sisters walking around with kind of a sign like psychic reading. And she starts giving psychic readings in New York in this period. So you have this huge explosion, but what will happen is that Britain will become a major reader and a spokesman for Abe Lincoln. But what else do we know about Emma Britton? She will found the Theosophical Society. It's interesting when you do these different histories around theosophy. They talk about Besant, they talk about Blavatsky, of course, Alcott, and all the rest. But Emma Britton founded the American version of the Theosophical Society with Blavatsky, who called her the best medium that she'd ever worked with or had ever seen. So, when we're looking at that whole piece, and then we realize that she was associated with Abe Lincoln, we're already in the 1860s, and Emma Britton is here laying the groundwork for all this, so that by the time she puts together the Boston version of Theosophy and the New York version is put together by Blavatsky, that's 1875. So these things have already been building up. The Orphic Circle has already happened. Emma Britton's been that channel in the middle. And what they were doing with her was they were having her channel this, very deep information about any subject, very a la Casey. They could do world affairs things. They could do personal things. They could do the nature of reality, spirituality, whatever it was. And they used her dramatically for this whole process, but it also brought her psychic process to a place. So we have a number of different things happening in that period, and basically theosophy and anthroposophy come out of it. And now we look back on that and we say, where are the mystery schools now? And what we have is this influence, this overhang influence. And then you see again that the way that it works, it isn't always the same type of thing. You're not always going to get a group that will come up and produce all this phenomena and all the rest. In the case of, Edgar Cayce coming up, he's very different from Steiner and Blavatsky in that he goes and gives these trance readings and goes back to Atlantis and reads past lives and all the rest of it. Now they'll provide information, Steiner and Blavatsky, about, this great period of humanity involving Atlantis, and give us a great background on this. And they'll also tell us a great deal about how that political process is manipulated. I've got some very key quotes here tonight from Steiner. But what I think is interesting is at a certain point, because of all the trouble involving Blavatsky with her trying to join the American mystery schools, and them saying, she's incredibly talented and sharing all this stuff with her, and then being like, we can't let you in. They do a number of things, what Steiner calls psychic imprisonment, occult imprisonment, to kind of psychically interfere with her whole process. And so by the time you get to that, the schools are looking for another way to make this happen, because Blavatsky's under such psychic attack, she can't do it. And I think that they look forward to Edgar Cayce. And I think Cayce is the next, piece that's associated with this. So it's interesting when we get around theosophy, we have to see that it set loose all of these different things, that the environment was there. And if you go back before Blavatsky, you're going to find something similar happened in France with Mesmer. So again, I think these schools have a habit of experimenting and see how they can move the culture forward without over influencing it too much. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. All right, this is what we're going to do next. Next, we're going to jump ahead to Ronald Reagan, if you're ready. Of course, that is Helena Blavatsky, who, in 60 years of living, basically revolutionized things dramatically. And as a Russian and as a woman, coming over here and doing the things that she did to build the Theosophical Society, unbelievable impact. And, so it is, the authenticity of her effort, I think, is recorded in all this. What's missing maybe is, and what we see is, when we look at Blavatsky, she's not perfect as a person. And so there's a lot of stories back there about her giving people hell. And, she embarrasses Alcott. She embarrasses certain people. Things happen. But I think in terms of the things that she was trying to do, if you look at Theosophy and the things that it accomplished, so much of it would really blossom in the 1960s. Reincarnation, psychic development, cremation, yoga. The first cremation took place in the United States at Theosophical headquarters. So, they introduced all of these what seemed like Eastern concepts, but really Western esoteric concepts. And that whole wave, of us understanding third eye pieces and all the rest, and I think the yoga trend really has a lot to do with this, because we can see the impact of Theosophy directly through this wave that takes place. Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm having some actual personal trolls tonight, and I have to take
care
of it. So they're actually, I can feel it. They're trying to bring the vibe down, and I'm not letting them.
Absolutely. So. Look, when you mess with Olivia, you're messing with the wrong.
I won't have it.
Entity. But yes, give them hell. What did I used to say? It was like, if you are from a 3-letter agency using 4-letter words, you just met a 5-star general.
Sorry, here comes another delete.
So let's flip around here and see if we can get how Reagan fits in here. Before we do, speaking of like flash forwarding to the 60s from that period, that's Henry Wallace doing his progressive, I'm an independent and I'm running on the peace platform. And there is Pete Seeger, the kind of Woody Guthrie type figure, giving his, I love America, this land is my land thing. That's 1948. I mean, is that not shades of Bob Dylan and all this stuff? So these people were ahead of their time. It's just the times were not there yet for them, which is why guys like Wallace show up very interestingly. He, one of the things about Wallace before we leave him is it's very interesting. When you go back, I do so much X-steganography on this show. That's the back of the $1 bill. And I think it's 1917. That's what we had, which is the X-steganography. It was lumen large. And it is, in fact, through our friend Henry Wallace that we get the original seal of the United States on the back of the dollar and all of that all-seeing eye pyramid stuff. And this is interesting because, again, it's the seal of the United States. It's associated with that whole Illuminati Masonic thing. And yet, this is also the very deep signature of the mystery school. So we have to figure out what's going on there with that, and who has appropriated it. Which school has gone to work on that? One thing that's in the Halcyon book, which I recommend because it's strange. Halcyon is very much left off as the movement of theosophy, but in a way, it's a very pure version of theosophy, shall we say? But here's what they have to say about Wallace, who is a member, remember, of the Halcyon Temple of Theosophy, not just the regular run, but this Halcyon Temple, which I said before involves the Varian brothers. It's got so many interesting scientific influences that it's very associated with laying the foundations for the 21st century. So they're talking here about the whole Roerich Pact, which is an interesting thing that happens. And this Roerich character with Wallace and FDR put together the Roerich Pact that all these nations signed in 1935 that says, even if we go to war and even if we blow each other up, we'll leave these special monuments alone, So, we won't blow up Notre Dame or something of this nature. And this is something that they all agree to, and that's a major movement of Roerich dealing with Wallace. So Roerich became known for his banner of peace and the Roerich Pact, the international peace treaty protecting cultural treasures throughout the world. The pact, which was based on respect for cultural creativity, was signed in the White House in 1935. It sought to protect cultural objects and educational, artistic, and scientific institutions, their personnel, property, and collections. So museums and everything like that. We know the Nazis looted so many museums. Behind the scenes in FDR's presidential administration, Roerich was influential through his student Henry Wallace, who served as the Secretary of Agriculture and later as Vice President of the United States. It was Wallace who convinced Henry Morgenthau, Secretary of the Treasury, to include the Great Pyramid from the Great Seal of the United States on the dollar bill, footnoting the eye of the masters. Wallace also corresponded with the temple, and there are letters between him and the leader of the temple that go all the way up to 1931. After that, I think, when he becomes vice president, it might be a liability. So, they go off the stage a little bit. And of course, the man who's able to push him off that stage is our master Mason friend, Harry Truman. So we're going to go to Reagan now. One thing I want to say before we get to Reagan is speaking about these Masonic influences. So we've got Truman, who's a Mason, and Wallace is also a Mason. He sort of gives it up for theosophy. But then we have FDR, who's a Mason and an odd fellow and belongs to other groups as well. So the whole thrust of the Masonic piece is there. Whenever you get around the presidency, remember Benjamin Franklin, the founding fathers, so deep in this Masonic imagery. So we have there, in trying to understand the Masonic part, is what is it that's going on there? What is the nature of the esoteric level versus what we traditionally know as just the regular Masonic lodges? Interesting, another Roosevelt was a Mason, and this is what President Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, who addressed the Grand Lodge in Pennsylvania in 1902 on the anniversary of Washington's initiation. In his speech, he reflected on some of his own reasons for joining the Freemasons. Quote, "One of the things that attracted me so greatly to Masonry, that I hailed the chance of becoming a Mason, was that it really did act up to what we as a government and as a people are pledged to, of treating each man on his merits as a man. When Brother George Washington went into the lodge of the fraternity, he went into the one place in the United States where he stood below or above his fellows according to their official position in the lodge. He went into the place where the idea of our government was realized as far as it is humanly possible for mankind to realize a lofty idea. This is interesting because, of course, he took some heat from being a Mason as well, because there were a lot of anti-Masonic movements. But we can see that there is a thread of these very idealistic presidents who associate the Masonic groups with the founding fathers piece, and then that's how they're lured into that system, and they talk about the benefits. Later, we find people are Masons and don't talk about it. This is why it's hard to say exactly how many of the presidents are Masons, because the last one on record is Ford. So, Reagan, in fact, and his whole threads to the mystery schools come from a very different place. It actually comes out of Hollywood, interestingly enough. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show deep here tonight on the mystery school presidents. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program. Miss Olivia is putting those together now, as long as the troll contingent has calmed down. And that's another thing I want to point out, which is go to darkjournalist.com, especially if you're new, and sign up for the newsletter. That's the way that we stay in touch with you, bypassing so much of that kind of censorship that goes on whenever you get around the deep topics that we're doing. And, I've been saying 2023, we have to go for potency, for deeper levels of potency in terms of the reporting. And so we're going to see a lot of fluff on top around the subjects that are compelling, but we're going to see sort of fluff jobs, on top. And we've seen a lot of that, actually, these very the UFO file is always a good way to weigh that out. But you see kind of superficial treatments of Atlantis, superficial treatments of the UFO file, superficial treatments of the JFK assassination all over the place. They're hitting everyone over the head with that right now. But these subjects we've gone into, and we've found the deeper levels around it. There's always more to find, but the approach is so important, and it's a very no holds barred, potent approach to bringing the information forward. That's what I think we need in 2023. The other thing that I'd like to parade around as a slogan, if you'll allow me to, out there in the ideas room, is no surrender. No surrender, no surrender of our rights, no surrender of our currency, no surrender to biometric surveillance, just no surrender. It's not going to happen. And, if they want to do things that way, they got another thing coming. What heavy metal band is that? Someone out there is going to tell us. But that's pretty much, after.
Is it Judas Priest?
It is. Yeah, bingo. But the thing is, after watching, the COVID lockdowns and the domestic terror bills, and, the thing that they're freaking out about at Davos is, how can we keep the populism wave from striking? Oh, I know. Let's just make sure that no one can talk to each other. And I think in their back pocket is this idea of a new internet. I've seen it. We're going to see more pieces of that emerging. But the idea is, oh, we were cyber attacked by Russia, but don't worry, you get to go back online. Hey, by the way, you need a biometric signature to do it. And we know this great company called Pfizer that's going to give you one for free. But the government's going to pay them billions. So, these are the things that they have cooked up. These things are related when we look through the lens of history. And I think the mystery school and the impact on the presidents is remarkable for us to realize the deeper story and what takes place behind the scenes. And I've got some good quotes from Steiner and Casey on that tonight, so we will get to those as well. All right, this is an interesting chart. It says things like late December through March, bad. January 16th to 23rd, very bad. No outside activity, no trips, exposure. Careful, stay home. This is what an astrologer was giving to Ronald Reagan before his assassination, because it came out later that not only were the Reagans using astrologers at the White House, but they had astrologers, psychics, soothsayers, you name it. And they'd had this going on for years. And one of the deep things that inspired Reagan into politics was a story that was told by Manly P. Hall in Secret Teachings of All Ages. So I guess we know that Reagan was reading high-class esoteric material when he was developing his, well, that came out, I think, in 1928. So Reagan, he's a teenager in that period, becomes an actor in the 30s. He's picking up these things that are out there. But it's going to be important because Manly P. Hall shows up a lot in the Reagan story. As does our friend Jean Dixon. And Dixon's particularly important because she's been on deck with the presidents since FDR. In fact, she was called in when FDR was sick. And it's very interesting to reflect on that because FDR asked her, how long have I got? And she said, not long, which is also the position that Casey played in relation to Wilson. And actually, I'm going to flash to Casey and Wilson real briefly here because this again gives us that setup. And I found something that might help us to understand how the Wilsons and the Caseys really developed this strong partnership. There were cousins of Casey's who were Wilsons, and I'm going to give you those names. But, I still was like, okay, it was the cousins that got him in touch. That makes sense. And the story goes that Casey went to the White House on a number of occasions. Somebody who did some really good research on it is Sidney Kirkpatrick. And later, even more information, they became even more certain about this. But a couple of quick mentions here. Yeah, so it was the president for whom Casey gave readings. Alf Wilson, the president's cousin, was known to have been in Washington, D.C. at the same time as Casey, and early the next year accompanied him to New York, where they joined Dave Kahn. And Kahn, if you know in that story, is so important because he's the guy who's a mover and shaker, and he keeps going back to Casey and getting readings, and they're best friends. And it will be, in fact, Kahn who spells trouble when these stockbrokers get a hold of Casey and they're having a great time and they're building the hospital and the ARE and Casey's going to be a big success. But they say, you know what, Dave Kahn, you can't keep doing readings for him. And that becomes the real fork in the road for Casey and these very influential investors. And he says, there's no way, there's no amount of money you could pay me not to read for my friend. Forget it. And they do everything. They actually sue Casey for the house that he's living in. And that is the Blumenthal story. It's a very interesting story, in fact. There's been much mystery regarding President Wilson's activities during the same time period Casey was there. By all accounts, the president's duties were being conducted entirely by his wife, the president's secretary, Joseph Tumulty, and various cabinet members. This is a period where, the wear of the presidency has really got to Wilson, and he's physically deteriorating. So he has a stroke, and then secretly through these channels, they call Casey to the White House. Now, there's been such secrecy regarding the activities taking place on Pennsylvania Avenue that rumors circulated among Washington insiders that the president might be dead or completely incapacitated. That's how heavy duty. He just was nowhere in public. And this is how they'll do it with Stepford Biden, too. We just won't see him for a while. The truth of Casey's visit may never be known. Having failed in his effort to have the League of Nations ratified, Wilson was a mere shadow of his former self, and he died in relative seclusion in February 1924. Now, there's a number of things there about Wilson. One of them, which I think is important, is that there was someone in his circle who served in his early security Secret Service detail. And he's a very interesting person. And his name is Edmund Starling. He was close to the Caseys. And when you try to find and thread the needle of how does this work, how did Starling in the White House, how was he close to Edgar Casey? Well, it's really interesting because Starling, who'd worked with FDR, worked with Wilson, or Coolidge, and every other president, had all these amazing stories that he told later in a book. And if you look at the author of that book, you can see down here that it says, as told to Thomas Chagru. And of course, Chagru is the author of the story of Edgar Casey. So there's our really deep connection between Starling of the White House and There Is a River, the story of Edgar Casey. They're both the same author. And it's that author that is the crisscross there. So Starling is aware of Casey, and he's also another factor along with Wilson's cousins. They bring Casey to the White House, and the story is expanded from there, which is that not only did Casey give regular health readings for Wilson in that period, but he helped him lay out the famous 14 points. This is important because the League of Nations wasn't ratified, and there were a lot of reasons for that. But Casey was saying in the period, if Wilson didn't lay the foundation, and that whole thing about the Treaty of Versailles was so brutal with the victors taking a toll on Germany and other places, that it would set up the conditions for another world war, and it would be sort of the pattern would be set there. And it took us only some 20 years to get there all over again. And that war was 10 times worse than the first one. So Casey is here working through Wilson. Now, Wilson has some dubious things in his background, one of which is that he's responsible for helping the Federal Reserve get established. There's a lot of regret later in Wilson's life about the Federal Reserve aspect. And he at one point says, I think I've doomed the banking system by doing this. But he felt at the time that other bankers like JP Morgan, it was too easy to manipulate the economy. So he fell for this. Now, he led us through World War I. And it's very interesting because when it comes to the Treaty of Versailles, Casey says in relation to Wilson, even though he's not thought of as an unusually godly man, the Christ himself was present through the figure of Wilson at Versailles. So here's Wilson trying to negotiate a just peace, and he gets overruled basically, and Britain and France take incredible advantage of Germany, and Germany goes into the tank, and they go so far into the tank that you have to spend $36 to buy an egg and things of this nature with the inflation. And it sets up, this fascist system as a throwback, and to get the yoke of the oppressive victors and bankers off our shoulders. And so that, this whole cycle goes around again. And underneath it is this pattern of these groups operating. And so you get arms dealers, you get bankers, and all these different pieces. And this is what we understand as the deep state going into 2023 here. The foundations for these things have been there for a long time, and they've been identified even by people like Wilson and FDR. The question is, we need a kind of wide scale movement of awareness in order to raise our consciousness to the level where we can see these things and throw them off. This is apparently the period to do that. And it's been a consistent effort on the behalf of the mystery schools to achieve that end. But there's a split there because those left-handed schools of the secret societies and political circles, boom, we find ourselves face to face with them. And what are they doing? They're facing us off against Ukraine. They want a nuclear exchange. I mean, they want these types of lockdowns. They want us to pay for breathing, basically. So this is the nature of the thing. It's moved through the centuries. It's moved through the decades. And I think that the thing that we find is that on that higher level, these people are being influenced by one degree of mystery school or another. And so we find there the mystery school influence through Casey, the Great White Brotherhood, Rosicrucians, all those different forces that work with him in his readings, get up to that level of serving the president. And the next round that we really see that again is Wallace and Theosophy. And then by the time we get to FDR again in the 40s, it's the same thing. Now, interestingly enough, Casey identified somebody back there who was going to get us out of this war footing, and we weren't going to go into World War II. And he's a very interesting senator. You've probably never heard of him. His name is Burton Wheeler. And through the readings we have now, his name has come out, and he was this very interesting senator. We're going to talk about him in a minute. And before we do, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Val says Steiner was not a fan of Wilson's. Wilson was an extreme racist who was in thrall to the bankers. Steiner thought he was causing a lot of damage in the world.
Well, it's true that there's a split in how Casey sees Wilson versus how Steiner sees him. And that's one of those things that you see once in a while. And I think what you just, even though these people get up to a certain level, they have their own opinions. It's not universal. What is interesting is when you look at areas where they completely overlap. And one of them is when they look at the reincarnations of very important personages over the eras. So one of them, for example, is John the Baptist, who, is even referred to by Jesus as Elijah, having come back as Elijah. Elijah come back as John the Baptist. Well, when we go into the Steiner work, he identifies him as Raphael, and later as a great German poet. But as Raphael, he comes back and he does all these incredible paintings. And then if you look in the Casey readings, you've got that lined up exactly. The next incarnation of John the Baptist is Raphael. Very interesting. And Wheeler, when we talk about him tonight, we're going to get to somebody who also had a very interesting series of past lives. Burton Wheeler, it's very interesting what Casey said, and this is another interesting setup because, again, there's this political tie over, and these people become aware of Casey who are associated with Burton Wheeler. And he is a very interesting senator from Montana, and he lives close to Livingston. Interestingly enough, if you look through the Casey readings, you're going to find that Livingston is identified as a place that's going to someday feed the world. And it's one of the reasons why, if you go up there, you're going to find the Church Universal and Triumphant of Elizabeth Clare Prophet. And they're there expecting, hey, we're right in the center. Well, she moved everything to where Casey said, this is the place that's going to feed the world. That's a pretty good plan. The question is, why did Casey see that? What is it about Montana that would someday feed the world, along with areas of Saskatchewan in Canada and South Africa? Why was Casey giving us this piece? Well, in any case, our friend Burton Wheeler was the senator there, and he was living close to Livingston. Let's get a little dose of his past lives here. This one, I'm going to go to these readings. So he's got two significant past lives. One of them, he's with Leif Erikson. And this is very interesting. There's a weird synchronicity that takes place here. But he's on one of these trips with Leif Erikson to discover America. So they're both Vikings, and he's like the understudy. In his real life, his only defeat that he will face as a senator will be to someone named Leif Erikson. But Casey had identified this past life for him 10 years before he loses his seat to this weird Leif Erikson. Figure that one out and tell me that, there isn't some interesting kind of time travel involved. All right. So he also says that this person, Burton Wheeler, had a past life as Cornelius, who's a Roman, and he converts to Christianity, and he's baptized by Peter. The baptism of Cornelius. Now, it's through these lives that he has this great kind of background to draw from to become president. Now, this is for the 1940 election. He's already been a senator since 1922. He ran independently in 1924 on an independent ticket with the same family from Wisconsin that will support the efforts of Joseph McCarthy, for you politicos who are keeping score on that. So there's a group of friends called the Harrisons who are very close to the Caseys, and they know Burton Wheeler, and they're like, there's a crisscross here. And Burton Wheeler has all of this mystical interest as a senator, and he is thinking, is it my destiny to run for president? So he has a series of readings with Casey. Here's just a little snapshot of this, of the man who would have been president, very much like Henry Wallace. And by the way, since we're mentioning Henry Wallace and Casey, Harmon Brough gives the story of shortly before Casey died, Henry Wallace phoning up and scheduling, his assistant from the White House scheduling a series of 3 readings with Casey for January 1945. And so that's on the record. And then Casey will die January 3rd, 1945. So that series of readings never happened. But Wallace was very much aware of Casey. So that hotline to Casey from the presidents, which started back in Wilson's time, apparently was still available because Wallace knew all about him. All right. In describing yet another of Wheeler's experiences he could draw upon in the present, Casey said, again, the entity in the present finds itself in that position where it may stand not merely as a pacifist, but as conducting or proclaiming or carrying peace through brotherly love and kindness and gentleness, even as was in the great tenet in him who indeed was the peacemaker. So this whole experience with Peter was with him, basically. So then we get some questions from Wheeler to Casey about how am I going to take the presidency, basically. And he says, am I following a correct life course in accordance with my experience? Wheeler asked. And the answer is, following in the correct life course in aiding, directing those of thy fellow man in a representative manner. It is indicated, the next question, is it indicated that I will be the next president of the United States? This is Wheeler's question. Casey answers, if there is a choice by the entity that it would desire to be, but that the entity would set what it would be its principles and not someone else's, it may be this entity, the president of the United States. So Wheeler goes on, is it a destiny consistent with the nation's destiny that I be the next president? Unless there be such one as this entity arising to direct not only the ship of state, but the destiny of the peoples of this land, turmoils and strifes must increase. Along these same lines, Wheeler's final question, is there any advice that you can give me as to whether or not I can give my greatest life service through being the president of the United States? And then the answer is, here's the greater service, even as you rendered not only thy nation as the ruler in Caesarea or Cornelius, but to all of mankind, because of that stand you took then. The final answer, the stand that you took, had great relevance to Wheeler. So what's interesting is what happens is he goes and he's planning to run against Roosevelt. And he has a meeting with Roosevelt and says, you're going to get us into war. You try to pack the Supreme Court. I was against you on that. And I want to let you know as a courtesy that I'm going to run against you. And in essence, Roosevelt talks him out of it and says, you can be my vice president. So Henry Wallace would be out and Roosevelt would take Burton Wheeler. And, Wheeler basically is like, I'm going to serve you as president. And if you take us into war, it'll be on my conscience. So I'm not going to do it that way. But later he considers the idea of if he should run against FDR. And you can hear almost an uncertainty in the questioning by Wheeler when he's talking, like, is it my destiny? Is this for me? Is this, is this supposed to be my thing? And I think it is that questioning that makes him shaky. And in fact, what happens is he doesn't take the vice presidency and he doesn't run against FDR. He stays on as senator and he basically, the war hits and he just goes along with things. Strangely enough, he loses for the first time in 22 years the Senate seat, and he loses it to Leif Erikson, someone named Leif Erikson, as I said. So there's a very strange destiny there for people. But again, it's so interesting when you see it from a mystery school perspective, your perspective, mine. It's about the choices that people make. And Burton Wheeler has everything laid out for him. And even Casey has given him, the signal from the mystery schools. This is it. This is your destiny. Move. He can't do it. He doesn't bring himself to do it. And everything falls within the realm of the choices that you make. This is a deeper lesson as we go into these kind of very broad, heavy subjects. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Deep tonight with the presidents and the mystery schools. There is Edgar Casey again, showing up on the radar around the presidents, and Burton Wheeler, who you don't hear a whole heck of a lot about. We're going to be taking your questions here shortly. And I have this section on Reagan and Manly P. Hall, which is a mind blower. And then we'll have some fun with the greatest American hero and John Hinckley. Before we do any of that, how are you doing out there?
Doing great.
Yes.
David Tremino wanted to know, DJ, during the anti-Masonic period, a large contingent of Masons created the Mormon mythology and religion, all while recruiting new members into high degrees in one day, including Joseph Smith. Is the Mormon mythology a type of secret society sharing of information or an obfuscation?
That's a really great question. I spent so much time studying the Mormons and studying the history of the Mormon religion, how it came about. And the Mormons' story answers a lot of questions and correlates a lot with the mystery school information about the lost tribes that came over and, they went across the ocean. There was all kinds of consternation back in the day when people would think about this, because they thought the Mormons could never have made it over from Israel in a boat across the Atlantic. They didn't do that back then. And then there were a series of people in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, Tor Heyerdahl and all these others, who went and used the same type of boats that they had, the reed boats and all the rest of it, and traveled under difficult circumstances and made it. And this is the story. Now, if you go back even further, remember there's an older chapter in that Mormon story too that sounds very much like an Atlantean story. But there's a lot that took place in America, which there's almost no record of. And we know that Cortez destroyed so many of the mine records. But as you get further along and further up, there are a number of things that happened right on the North American continent which haven't been preserved. And the Mormon story opens up a good deal of that. The fact that he found these very unusual tablets and all the rest of it. Now, the Mormon, a lot of things have happened with it. In fact, when we get into presidents, of course, we should say another person who was going to be president and never made it was Joseph Smith, because that's what he was doing, running for president. And but things had happened. His demeanor had changed. He was wearing military clothes, and he was running a newspaper that was very critical of the United States, and they decided, we're just going to take this guy out. And when they take him and his brother into a jail cell, the crowd is coming for them, and so they jump out the window and the crowd kills them. This, rapid sort of thwarting of the Mormons is part of the power struggles that we see. But I think I've never thought of the Mormons as like a made up story or something of this nature. Obviously, there's some root to the original Mormon story. And when you get around the whole Pleiadian aspect around the UFO file, it feels there's a lot of Mormon pieces to that. Unfortunately, later in political life, the Central Intelligence Agency decided they could use the Mormon temple, and they infested it. And it could have been some kind of a trade-off, like, if you let us survive, we'll let you. The Mormon temples could have been saying, if you let us carry on, we'll become sort of intelligence conduits for you. So there's a terrific and terrible influence of the Central Intelligence Agency on the Mormons. But I don't know that goes against the entire message of what they were doing. So no, there's something certainly fascinating in relation to that. And just like the Masons piece, there's something weird, and there's something manipulated, but there's also kind of a root core to it. And I think what we see has something to do with there's an episode I have coming up, and I'll let it out of the bag, but it's a Rudolf Steiner episode talking all about the power zone. And so this is just a hint of what's coming, but basically those brothers of the left-hand school, he refers to in some very early lectures with this name, the power zone. And I think,
Do you have that diagram?
yes, I do. I have a lot of Steiner stuff I'm going to bring for. Maybe I'll do the Steiner part now and then do Reagan.
Sounds good.
So one of the things I think we need to wrap our heads around is anthroposophy, like theosophy, but probably even more precise, wasn't only, sort of cosmic awareness, So I like the cosmic aspects of anthroposophy. I think I understand them. But there's a very hardcore political analysis. Steiner is very interesting. Again, he's like 5 people. This is somebody who actually did reviews of theater too. So, he's in every aspect of regular everyday life, and the farming and eurythmy and all these other things. It's almost like a very well-rounded Renaissance life, so just like his hero, Goethe is, he's scientific, he's a poet. That's how they were. These were the Renaissance men. And somehow that got transposed later. And, you were either a scientist or a poet. You weren't both of them together because they were 2 different types of mental activity. And I think what happens is when you really look at the political analysis of Rudolf Steiner, it's remarkable. Somebody mentioned his attitudes towards Woodrow Wilson. Well, he gives a series of speeches on Wilson from 1913 to 1924, and they're remarkably, sometimes he says things about Wilson which are complimentary, and then later he's like, I think after World War I, he sort of turns on the whole thing, and he sees him as not a very developed person. But I think it's interesting because he can look at the mystery school influence on the political process, which is what we're trying to get to in this show, which is that influence is there. There are secret societies, there are mystery schools directing our political process that we know so very little about. The idea that they would be using, even on a regular basis, psychics and astrologers and all this kind of stuff, ordinary people thinking that would be like, that's crazy. Are they really doing that? And yet over and over again, that's the theme. One of the ways that they found this out about Gene Dixon in relation to Richard Nixon was somebody was examining a terrorist task force after 9/11, and they found 80 visits by Gene Dixon to Richard Nixon in relation to this. And they were like, what does she have to do with a terrorist task force? Well, she was giving psychic readings about terrorism events that would occur and what they should be ready for. And there are Nixon tapes that are out there with him talking about, Gene Dixon. So we have record of it anyway. But the idea that she had visited the White House multiple occasions, was that close, shows again that thread of Gene Dixon having that. And I've actually called her at one point the most powerful woman in the world, because if she had the ability to use her psychic ability and her astrological abilities to influence the president, think about that. The other thing that's notable about her is deep connections with the FBI and others, but very close friends with Strom Thurmond, who, was very deep into the UFO file and wrote the foreword for Philip Corso's book originally before they found out, oh my God, he's spilling UFO secrets. So, a lot of these things work together if you can get the perspective and just forget about what we've heard about them in public life and get rid of the kind of Today Show attitude about things and go much deeper into what are these people up to. And it's a more reasonable thing to consider, oh, you know what, they're in a position where they're running the world. They want every piece of intelligence they can get. They have channels that go back thousands of years in relation to the rule of the world around different techniques. And that's why I have the CIA piece so deep on things like psychic phenomena, remote viewing, and just exploiting these things because they figure their counterparts are going to do it. And so they don't have any reverence for the craft or anything like that, but they certainly know how to utilize these things. And when you go back to things like the Men in Black, things we've put forward about an astral agency, I have no doubt that there is an aspect of this that the CIA works with, a mystical aspect where they use mystics to not only get information from different countries, but to attack individuals. It's interesting. One of the things that Steiner talks about is the impact that takes place on, there are certain things that if he came out and said them, he would be under so much direct psychic attack that he wouldn't be able to protect himself against it. So, when we're talking about political figures, they have that kind of attention that's on them. And I remember there was a remote viewer who was trying to penetrate into the president's schedule or something like that. And he met with basically Astral Secret Service. So, it runs deep. I'm just going to tell you, it runs deep. Yes.
I want you to answer this question right
Sure.
now. So Knifey said, wouldn't the president have some, quote, psychic guardian, so to speak, to protect him from those influences?
Well, yeah, it's funny. I just said it. That's
yeah,
exactly. What it
exactly.
is.
So could you go into that a little bit more?
Well, I think that really captures it because, if you think of everything that we do on the regular side in terms of, protection, spy services, and all the rest of it, and you just transpose that, what we have, thank God, through the work of Russell Targ, is an honest account of those deep processes. And Russ has a new book that's coming out, which is going to, lift the lid off the final secrecy of all that. And this is something that we're looking forward to. But to understand that the government has been using these techniques on that deep a level is, a deep aha moment, because this is something that we've talked about here, in the Ideas Room with the X series over the course of almost 5 years here. But is this something that an average person would ever think, oh, they're using all these psychic services? But there's a definite public thread, so that we don't have to just imagine it. We have threads that go all the way back through Casey Wilson. And if we go back to Emma Britton, you've got Prime Minister Disraeli getting information from her as a teenage medium. So, what is that? The 1840s? Somewhere in there. And Disraeli, he might take office later, but he's in there. He's a politician in that group getting information. So yeah, that's deep, huh? There we go. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Here we are in X Series 144. This is the Mystery School Presidents. And we're definitely taking your questions here shortly, literally like 5 minutes. But great questions so far in the Ideas Room, and it's great to be here with everyone. I think the presidency, look, 2 years ago, we inaugurated Biden into office. And, there was this whole thing about the Trump election, and we all know what went down there. But it's very important for us to realize that the American presidency, regardless of what you hear, is still the most powerful office. And, I know a lot of people downplay it and are like, oh, the president doesn't matter, and don't worry about the presidential election. Look for your local congressperson or something like that. Let me tell you, the way that this operates is that, it's a body politic, and it has a physical body, and you need the head. And so you need the president to be in a line as the leader. So the idea, oh, that doesn't matter, is don't go down that road with it, just because the Biden election has made us all so cynical because Stepford Biden is walking around there as some weird puppet. And, there's so many strange things I could get into about Biden. But I would say don't let the cynicism overtake us, because the office is important. And, we've seen some remarkable things take place through the efforts of people and making those presidents respond. I remember there was a great outcry when Obama was trying to go into Syria, and he had John Kerry do the whole Colin Powell trip before the UN and all the rest of it. We've got a red line. We've got to stop him and his chemical weapons and all that. It's just because there were war forces that wanted to get into Syria. And Obama was a war president. He increased the number of troops that were in Afghanistan over George Bush's number. Think about that. So, I think if we take it from this level, which is originally the founding fathers said, avoid foreign entanglements. There's a reason for that. There were going to be forces that were always going to see it as advantageous for us to go over there and get involved in their wars. And we've seen this process play out. I think we've had enough people die over that. And, we can influence the thing as a world group of nations individually doing things, rather than the idea of the United States as a world policeman running around and, dumping all this money into Zelensky. How is that any different than what we did in Vietnam, except we don't yet have troops on the ground? So I don't, I think that we're in an era where we can learn a great deal from so many of the things that we've gone through on this. All right. With that, I am going to go next to Steiner for some of his quotes on this. Everyone, this is X Series 144. We're going to be taking your questions. Hey, it's 144. That's the length of time we've been on tonight. And I think there's some other 144 from tonight. But let's do a little bit of this so we get an idea of who we're up against. Who is the power zone? Well, we'll learn about them in full in another episode. However, they're right on the cusp of this episode. So let's get a few quotes from Steiner about who they are. The brothers of the left, after all. So he's talking about this period that I mentioned where a number of schools had gotten involved with the idea of spiritualism, pushing it out to the public. Now, they had all sorts of methods and means in these mystery schools and secret societies for working with mediumship and all these other things in relation to the spiritual realm, astral, etheric, and all these types of talents. So what they wanted to do was introduce the idea publicly, and the good group, the group around the right-hand path, were trying to increase the knowledge in the public of these psychic abilities so they'd have something to kind of have a shield against all this scientific materialism that was coming in, this harmonic wave, which we, have arrived at with the kind of virtual reality 21st century. But there was another group in there that wanted to see if they could utilize this whole thing. And so he talks about these two groups, and I find this dialogue fascinating. So we'll just flash on it here. Well-meaning spiritual members of the brotherhoods were of the mistaken opinion that by using mediums, they could convince people of the existence of a spiritual world that surrounds them. On the basis of this conviction, one would then be able to teach them further higher truths. This would have worked if what had been assumed by these well-meaning members had taken place, if what had made its appearance through such mediums had been explained to people in terms of a spiritual world that completely surrounds them. What happened, however, was something quite else. What made its appearance through the mediums was interpreted by the people who participated in these events as having originated from the dead. And again, there was so much of this that was about contacting the dead. It was mediumship. It was table rapping, all the incredible things that were taking place. And you were getting these messages from beyond, and life after death, and so much around this. What made its appearance to the mediums was interpreted by the people who participated in these events as having originated from the dead. Thus, what was brought to light by Spiritism was actually a disappointment for all. Those who had let themselves be outvoted were extremely aggrieved. Of course, that in the Spiritist seances one could talk, sometimes rightly so, about the manifestations of spirits. This well-meaning progressive initiates had not expected there to be talk about the dead at all, but had expected people to speak of a general world of elemental spirits. This is interesting. They thought, they're going to encounter these other beings. And instead, the whole thing got, down to this basic level. There was somebody named the Poughkeepsie Seer, who was like an early version of Edgar Cayce, and he sees Summerland, which is exactly what happens to us after we die. And it's exactly like our regular everyday life. And so all these people are living that. And that's what's coming back. The feedback loop is people are like, oh, so when we die, what happens is exactly like what's going on here on Earth, which is apparently not what these brotherhoods wanted to come forward at all. The mystery schools were looking for people to grasp the idea that there's a spiritual afterlife. Okay. And so we have, besides the members of the brotherhoods already mentioned, initiate members of other brotherhoods. Okay? And in some cases of the same brotherhoods in which minorities and sometimes majorities can form, we have to consider these other initiates who are known within the brotherhoods as the brothers of the left. This is a crucial aspect, which is to say those who exploit everything in the pursuit of power that as an impulse is incorporated into the evolution of humanity. And naturally, those brothers of the left also had all sorts of expectations of what made its appearance through Spiritism. Yesterday, I remarked that it was these brothers of the left, above all, who held seances with the souls of the dead. For them, what was most interesting was that what would result from the Spiritist seances, they gradually took control of the entire field, while the well-meaning initiates gradually lost all interest in Spiritism, and even felt ashamed in a sense, since those who had not wanted Spiritism from the start told them that one could have known from the outset that nothing would have come of Spiritism at the present time. This is how Spiritism fell into what would be called the power zone of the brothers of the left. Now, these same power zone brothers of the left are deeply involved in the political process. And this is the thing I think that we can bring out so that we understand from a mystery school perspective that when we're talking about presidents and leadership, that there's a deep secret society aspect driving this process, and that you have initiates who are trying to move the culture forward, and you have the power zone. And the power zone brotherhoods and mystery schools, secret societies of the left-hand path, that's the piece that we need to bring forward now in order to get a better picture of who we're dealing with. And I think that that's crucial, especially when we're coming up into an election period with all the things that are at stake, with America as, ostensibly the leader of the free world and what's left of it. This is going to be very important in terms of how we look at this. And with that, I'm actually going to go to your questions, Miss Olivia, and I'll roll in the Reagan stuff as we go.
All right. So the questions are all over the place.
Yes.
All right. So let's start with this. Chris Lothian, were the Masonic presidents subordinate to their lodge masters or higher ranking Masons?
Well, it's interesting, right? Steiner was just describing how in the power zone groups, the way that they can develop is by peeling off minorities into a majority over here to go for a certain type of thing. So it seems like there's almost a voting type process that takes place inside the schools. So I'm going to transpose that down to the Masonic level, and I would say it's probably the same type of thing. But it seems to me that we know through study around different levels of Masonic pieces that when you're dealing with the kind of protection that certain Masonic groups offer their members, that, there's a level of obedience, protection, and dedication. And that's all, so again, it's the degree lesser, it's the lesser degree or the more intense degree. That's where the answer to that question would be found. I would say the more intense the Mason, the deeper in the system they are, the more obedient to the structure. Yes.
History's Mysteries Unveiled. Surprised you haven't mentioned the obelisks in DC. They were present at Heliopolis Mystery School in ancient Kemet and at Eleusis in Greece.
Yeah, if this was a straight up show on Masonry, then certainly you're absolutely right. But this is more about the whole mystery school field, which is a lot bigger than just Masonic. Um, and but it's absolutely crucial to consider and know, that Washington D.C. was laid out under those Masonic rites, and in many cases, they were using the actual Egyptian obelisks, as we've seen, and we've done stories in relation to that. So again, if you haven't found it in this episode, chances are it's in the X series. You just have to know your titles. And I'll tell you, I'm proud to say that we've got, something like this is episode 144, but there's actually something, because there are a lot of part twos and things. You get close to 170 episodes that are free right there on this channel and available for you. So go title shopping on that, and you probably get some of those answers, especially if you look into the Dixon episodes. Yes.
Okay. Richard Helder, can Daniel address the idea of the 9 Masonic signers of the Declaration of Independence as a foil for the 9 founding gods of the Egyptian pantheon?
Wow. Well, it's interesting because I have that Manly P. Hall story. And I think the Manly P. Hall story about the mystery school initiate who shows up to make sure that the signers of the Declaration of Independence go through with it is the pertinent answer to that question. But I'm going to read that at the end. I have it here and at the ready, and I promise that I will, but I'm going to save it. Yes.
Guangalist Bygone. Aren't the Jesuits at the top of the mystery schools? And Val says, isn't it also true that the Illuminati infiltrated the Freemasons and basically took it over, corrupted it, and turned it into a power-seeking group?
Yeah, here's the thing to consider. There are Buddhist mystery schools. So there's no Jesuit influence on Buddhist mystery schools. So, it's not all Jesuits. And then if you go and you're looking at the Kabbalah and things of that nature, then again, you're dealing with other things. So there's all sorts of mystery schools. And that's what we learn through the study of the work of anthroposophy. But I think that what we look at and what we can see is that on a certain level, the groups that are moving the culture forward, whether it's they're coming from a Christian perspective or a Buddhist perspective, that they are they're both engaged in the same total process. It's just that there are different paths on that process. The thing that I would say is that it comes to light in a lot of the mystery school training that it seems like the East, this is the anthroposophical view, set up the next wave, which is the Western initiators. And that's the whole Rosicrucian piece. That's American Western mystery schools as setting up the next phase. Unfortunately, embedded in that is this Ahrimanic piece, which is directly at odds with advancing the culture. And it's more about dominating and harvesting humanity. There's a very excellent graph, which Miss Olivia referred to earlier, and I'll see if I can find it, but it is Steiner's graph, and it gives us some idea. That's a great shot. Someone did a cosmic shot of Steiner. Here's something that Steiner had to say about this. So take a look at this shot. This is a Steiner graph, and I've just written power zone over by the power zone. So what Steiner's pointing out here is that basically this group, the power zone, is drawing from humanity the kind of sluggish aspects of humanity that are getting programmed that materialism is all there that's going to happen. And here's the way you could kind of take this as a shorthand for it. What Steiner is saying, in fact, is that this group, the power zone, is taking certain types of individuals and their materialist thinking and bringing them to such a state that when they die and go into the astral realm, they're bringing this view of materialism with them instead of moving on into the spiritual world and all the rest of it. And so that this group is collecting and harvesting those types of people. And that is basically the development of the eighth sphere. So the idea of the interruption of the natural evolution of a person on Earth, developing this kind of cosmic, spiritual, mental balance, is being overpowered by this other thing. And we've seen people, I've seen in my own life, people get completely obsessed around things that don't speak to, any kind of higher spirituality within them at all. They get lost in very deep ego escapades and things of this nature. Now, Steiner's giving us that graph and letting us know there's a force that's drawing on the average person. It's trying to dumb them down further and further and further. So in this era, they have the ability they have a simultaneous ability. One, with the technological tools, people can become more aware faster. But two, they're easier to manipulate. So therefore, this is the kind of gamble in the technology, that the technology has to become so superior that it overrides any sense of conscience within the individual. And in order to do that, they have to condition them really early, which is why Google wants to be your mommy and daddy. So this is the nature of the battle as it's laid out. And I'll tell you, it's very pertinent, I think, if we were to look at Steiner and what he was doing, looking out through that period that he's in into the 21st century. It's almost eerie to read him because it's so current. And this is the nature of the situation I think we find ourselves in. I wanted to use this quote from Steiner to give us some idea of what he sees as one of these mystery schools, and that's the Rosicrucian. And he says, the Rosicrucian movement worked in complete concealment up until the last third of the 19th century, which was true Rosicrucianism. What was true was Rosicrucianism could not be found in books and was also forbidden to be spoken of publicly. That's pretty interesting. Only in the last 30 years, we have a very few of the Rosicrucian teachings that have been made known to the outer world through the theosophical movement, and having been taught earlier only in what is called theosophy, the most strictly closed circles. The most elementary teachings of the Rosicrucians are included in what is called theosophy today, but only the most elementary. It's only possible bit by bit to allow mankind to look more deeply into this wisdom, which has been fostered in these Rosicrucian schools in Europe since the end of the 14th century. The end of the 14th century is the period that we get into where everything is about teaching through the intellect. So we lose so many of these other senses, and the emphasis around, I guess, you would consider it kind of the natural sense intelligence, intuition, and we have to learn it all intellectually. That's the 14th century post-Atlantean epoch that we're in till 3573, according to anthroposophy. That's a while. Yes.
Lois, is the core of the mystery schools not the direct interaction with guiding spirits in the spiritual world, good or evil, intending guiding spirits set the tone? And Rat Boy Genius, I think it's important to remember that the various mystery schools have different goals because they have different fundamental beliefs in the nature of being human. Yeah,
that's really true. Both of them are true. See, the thing is...
Could you talk for a second about the not just the intention of the basically the the beings, the ascended masters who are behind the groups, good or evil, left or right path, right? And what their agenda, who are they anyway? Who are we? Because that's what, there is a hierarchy in these groups.
Yeah, here's how I would put it from what we've learned. So it seems like a number of the spiritual teachings, religion, things like that, inform us that we're up against something. So in Genesis, you're up against some other intelligence which is outsmarting you right away. So obviously, as part of an evolutionary track, you have to face off against these things. In the Jesus story, there's the whole thing about going to the desert for 40 days and facing every kind of temptation. But the 40 days, we also get into that um, when we go into the Moses story. There's also a 40-day element that's involved in Noah, you know. So there's some theme there about facing off against forces. So the religions fundamentally are telling you this piece. And then, we have caricatures around periods of time when you know, uh, these groups, like I was speaking of Cortez earlier, who just completely decimated the Aztec civilization. And he showed up and said, well, I have God's mandate, so I can do it. So there's incredible misunderstanding that comes through these things, and they do the biggest atrocities. And any sense of authority, look at the atrocities that we're living through with the pharmaceutical industry right now. Any assumed authority, the scientists know better, that kind of thing, leads to this. We know better, and we have a good reason for killing you off. In the case of Cortez, it was, oh, you're such a corrupt culture and we're Christian, and, and I'm going to, kill you for Christ. I mean, this is the nature of the obsession around dominance. So this is the kind of spirit background. In the background, there are groups that are operate on different levels, physical levels, etheric levels, etc. And so I think some of the things that in anthroposophy or in the Casey readings, they've tried to bring forward this idea that, you're up against these forces when you're dealing in an earthly realm, and you have a natural spiritual protection and shield if you are aware enough to activate it. So the pattern is in you, right? One of the things that's so great about Casey's work is he talks about the patterns and activating the pattern. And, so when you go through and you look at that history from Amelius through Rata and all these individuals bringing forward this thing, there's a pattern there of awareness around something deeper going on, so that whole hero's journey idea is literally about awakening the pattern in yourself. And so many of the schools, the fundamental basis for self-development is awakening that pattern in yourself. And what is it that the Greeks say? It's know yourself. This is the this is the important piece. The Casey readings say, know yourself to be yourself and one with the whole, so you're part of all of creation, but you also know who you are. So, this is a deep, again, Casey is an evolution of these things. He brings in what would be fundamentally religious teachings, but he gives you the entire deep esoteric piece with it. And this is the nature, I think, like if I was to talk to you about revelation, I can give you a metaphysical interpretation of revelation that someone who is looking at it from a strictly religious point of view might not agree with. But they're there, it's there. So it operates on both sides. So, that wonderful phrase that Gurdjieff had, which is, what do we do? There's two sides to this. On the religious side, there's what to do and how to do it. And what to do is out there. It's, love one another, turn the other cheek, all these religious teachings that give you that understanding of that moral, ethical position. But then how to do it. That's underground. That's where the mystery schools, they keep the knowledge of how to do it and inform the culture of that. Because when they are up in the regular culture, the powers that be want to destroy them because you're teaching people to not be slaves. So, this is the nature of how deep that mystery training goes. So all the schools really have the know thyself as that kind of fundamental core piece. Yes.
I wanted to add, there's a quickening happening right now. And so I've certainly experienced it. Whatever you are intending, The answers are coming fast and furious. So if you have to start where you are, and
Yes.
we all know what we need to work on, and it's very humble work. We have to start from the ground up, and sometimes that means making your bed, and that means cleaning out your closet and doing all of that basic stuff to get your life in order so that you can actually meditate properly, effectively, and attune yourself effectively and properly. So I know we all want to join a mystery school and get on with it, but the first step is the first step, and you have many, right? So just get the ball rolling and it will start happening very quickly. So
Oh yeah, I mean, I like absolutely everything is where you are. There's no question, and it's one day at a time. What's interesting though about that is in the fourth way, in the Gurdjieff teaching, what needs to be done can only be done in the conditions of everyday life. So you can't do it by going away to a monastery or going onto a mountaintop or a retreat somewhere. You have to deal, if you're a librarian, then you're being aware as a librarian. If you're a policeman, you're aware as a policeman. These things happen where you're dealing with them. So that, to me, there's a reason why the fourth way piece came out, is because they were aware of the fact that in your everyday life, you were going to need the ability, a way to develop yourself and spiritually evolve under regular everyday conditions. That's what the times call for. All right. Yes. What do you got?
Page Wizards, is there anyone alive today that would be prominent in the mystery schools that you, DJ, would take seriously, that you know of?
Oh, there's all kinds of mystery school people. And I think that, they are interwoven and largely anonymous in society. No question about it. I think actually what we see is, the guru type trip was one type of thing that happened, and it was really happened to excess to the detriment of the guru and to the student. Now, if you think about the Beatles Maharishi thing, for example. So the Beatles were looking for something bigger than just their celebrity, and they went to the Maharishi for it. That was in the late 60s. So here we are, some 55 years later, let's say. And in the 21st century, that pattern will always be there of going to the guru and getting all the answers. But there's something else that is building up alongside of all this, which is after a real excess of that kind of period and a heavy New Age overhang from that. I think that there's something else, Bill. This is what I believe Steiner was referring to when he said anthroposophy gets another chance in 100 years, saying that about 1920, we're right in that window. And it seems to me a kind of, it's a collective action, but it is individual growth. And this is the nature of the period that we're seeing. We're being called to a different level of evolution on that front. And the battle is that the machinery, the technology has come at such a level and at such a pace that our level of wisdom hasn't caught up with it. And so you have this gigantic imbalance, and the correction of that imbalance is an incredible training ground for humanity. It's an incredible period of growth. And so this is the nature of the battle, but it is a very dangerous level. It's like, this whole thing about rediscovering Atlantis. Well, why is it that Atlantis got forgot back there? It's because there was massive destruction, and the massive destruction wasn't just a pole shift. It was because the Atlanteans had misused the knowledge and the ability. That's the story. The story isn't just, though there was a disaster, the disaster was perpetuated by the initiates in Atlantis. They misused the two-eye stone. This is Casey's story. That's the story of the Steiner work. They basically blew it up. And, they caused those disturbances on such a level. I've called that whole period and that whole piece that's referred to in steganography through the mystery schools, through ages, through the Book of the Dead and things, as apotheum. The reason I use that is because it's something, the only thing that I can relate it to is that all the apotheum physics defying effects that take place around the UFO experience, when people float through walls and all those things happen, nothing works, and there's no time and all that kind of stuff. That's all related directly. That's the same type of thing. Whatever it is, there's a process that takes place, and that the term apotheum refers directly to the nature of the distortion of regular physics. And so what happens is we get this memory of this thing, and it's an amnesia, as Graham Hancock calls it, because it's traumatic, but it's also, it's such massive destruction. So, the fact that it's self-inflicted, and the teachings of the mystery schools is that these people reincarnate, and, Casey says, hey, you're reincarnating, you're actually encountering the same conditions that you were around for in Atlantis. How are you going to deal with it this time? That to me is a much deeper message than just, we figured out that there was some earthquakes 20,000 years ago. That's totally different. The idea that the two-eye crystal caused the fracturing of the earth and opened up portals and things like that, that is the thing I think we need to get our heads wrapped around. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, deep tonight in the X series on the Mystery School presidents. And we're taking your questions now. We'll go here for another 15 minutes or so.
Okay, Nujat Madri, is there a difference between Masonic groups and cults like Skull and Bones? If there is, did they have their own deep state war to take over power?
Well, what's interesting is a group like Skull and Bones may include Masons, but it certainly is an entity that is of itself. So it's autonomous. And I think it came to serve certain interests that weren't satisfied with the reach of what was happening with other societies. But when we see people who are involved with it that early, like Taft, and the Bushes, and John Kerry, who's out there blathering on about, extraterrestrials this week, and how great it is that over there at the Davos crowd, that they are saying, hey, we want to we're here, we're a better group of people because we want to save the world. This is literally what he's saying. I'm not even joking. And then he says, that's extraterrestrial, So basically identifying himself and that group with benevolent ETs against all these stupid humans who want to destroy the planet after they have taken all the corporations' monies. And, this is the weird thing about Kerry.
Do you think that's admitting something?
I don't think you'd use a term like extraterrestrial when you're a guy like him. He's been in politics for how long? He's been a senator. He's been a secretary of state. You're not going to use the term extraterrestrial accidentally. I doubt it. So no, I think it is significant. Absolutely. But, for me, when you look at somebody like Kerry saying that, and you look at just like Gore, they have all these corporations, and I make no, bones about it. They have destroyed a lot of the environment. The environment is in trouble. It's true. But they're the ones who destroyed it. Make no mistake. When they were developing this, did they say, hey, by the way, we're going to get you these great products, but it's going to ruin the environment? No. They just said, here's the great product, pay for it, make us billionaires. And so my thing is, no. I don't, I don't think there's climate change. I think that there's environmental damage. And I think it's caused from the corporations and the higher political pieces. And I think they should be the ones to pay. Most of them keep their profits offshore, like Apple, for example. They have billions of dollars offshore, and not reinvested in the American economy. So if they are going to go to the Davos crowd and say, well, humanity is bad, we're going to get a new meter to make sure they don't use energy and don't breathe the oxygen and all the rest of it, and they're going to pay a carbon tax. my first thing would be, look, there's enough of you billionaires to start a great process of re-enhancing the environment, which it does need to be completely revived, because you guys have destroyed it with fracking and everything else. So yeah, I mean, have we bought the services and all the rest of it? Yes, but the truth is that who's become the top of the pyramid from doing this? And also, when you look at everything that they pulled with the COVID op, what happened? Did humanity develop some, great balancing? Was there a great sharing of resources? No. All that money went to the top. It went to Elon Musk. It went to Jeff Bezos. It went to Bill Gates. That's where the money went. So they were the ones who expanded and did well through the COVID op. So if you think it was a legitimate pandemic, then you should be twice as angry at those groups, and not angry in a way that is like out of your center angry. I just mean a kind of righteous anger. And when they come at you with this environmental stuff and say, hey, we need to save the planet, say, good, we start with the fact that you and your corporations have made excessive profits out of destroying the environment. So let's get you guys to put together a fund to start with, to put this together to clean things up. None of these politicians can do that because they're all beholden to these people to run for office. This is the nature of the problem for the people who run in 2024. On the Democratic side, it's already over. On the Republican side, you have enough populist influence still, even though the populism was usually identified with the Democrats, things have changed. So for me, I mean, that's how I see it. So absolutely, it's the nature. There is an environmental problem. The independent media should get on with that. We shouldn't deny that there's an environmental issue and just say, oh, they're making it all up. No, they destroy the environment for sure, but they're the ones who have the money to fix it. And the idea that they're going to take away the ability for you to have a car because they've done environmental damage. No, there's a lot of things, there's a lot of that pie that they're sitting on, including alternative energy. So is this going to be an honest conversation?
They've suppressed
absolutely
probably free energy.
No question about it. All right. Whew, that one got us going.
It would be good for them and their karma also. It's what they need to do for themselves.
Oh, they're so far beyond thinking like that.
Of course.
Excellent point. All right, everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Deep in the weeds tonight on the X series 144.
Should we go to the dark side a little bit?
Sure.
Okay, let's start here. Bob Smith, is Marina Abramovich related to any mystery school that DJ is aware of?
Well, what's interesting is there's a whole Golden Dawn Crowleyite aspect that is involved in politics as well. We didn't talk so much about them because we were sorting through the kind of Rosicrucian theosophical and left-hand path. The left-hand path definitely gets its, one of its deep players when the Golden Dawn piece comes out. And it's interesting because the Golden Dawn piece doesn't have to, there's so much interesting information in Golden Dawn. And, you're going to find that people like Crowley understood a great deal about metaphysical forces. It's just the aim of these groups and where they want to take it. That's the whole power zone piece. So, in terms of Abramovich and that whole wave that's hanging out there, there's deep illness in those types of secret societies. And they spread, through a number of celebrities, politicians, and others. I would say, if anything, what Stein is referring to on the power zone side has an incredibly outsized influence on entertainment. And that's why we see so much of the entertainment is corrupt. Now, I also think that we, can't go back to like some hyper conservative religious culture and do like a Muslim extremist thing, be like, you can't wear this symbol or whatever it is. This is the weird swings that you'll see. And you'll see that we'll get to a culture when this thing hits real pay dirt. We'll get to a culture that is throwing it off to such a degree that it'll be a kind of a conservative nightmare. So we don't want that either. So the whole trip really is about balancing the things that we've learned. The problem is in the harvesting aspect that goes on with groups, and you know, it can be a simple thing like, yeah, they're harvesting money from people, but I'm talking about on a much bigger, deeper level, the kind of Ahrimanic piece that Steiner gives us. He's talking really about something that harvests humanity. So it harvests its emotions, it harvests, you know, its activities, and keeps it in a loop and stops it from its natural evolutionary track. That's a deep place to go with it. And what happens, I think, is that we're looking at a series of groups that are involved. And I think the tentacles of those groups are into so many things. And we're seeing it so much with the pharmaceuticals right now, of course, but in entertainment, in politics, in economics, you know, in the COVID. I mean, it is saturated throughout society. So it's a real showdown in a sense. This decade kind of feels like one hell of a showdown. Yes.
I'm sorry, I missed it. Were you talking about Barbara Bush and Aleister Crowley?
I did not include
Okay,
Barbara Bush in
let's
that.
get into it. So, Traveling Riverside Blues Johnson wants to know Barbara Bush's father, Aleister Crowley.
You know, I'm going to tell you, there's so many things that float around that aren't true, that are like that. But the Barbara Bush story, and it's, you know, the way that it comes about and how it's possible that she could be Crowley's daughter, and the actual physical resemblance, non-Photoshop, you know, like you see all this stuff where they try to make people look like other people. The Barbara Bush story has legs. I'll just put it that way. And knowing who the Bushes are, they're deep, deep on the left-hand path side. As a matter of fact, with that much power, it's interesting because Reagan probably felt himself a deep mystical player being involved with all the different groups that he was involved in. But he had on his heels very, very dark players, all the way with those family ties of Prescott Bush and George Sr. and Jr. So Reagan was, in fact, surrounded by that, and had some kind of.
Are we going to get into The Greatest American Hero?
I have it here. You know, but you reminded me of this picture that I had of Reagan and the Bushes. Well, I'll tell you what I can do is I'll do a quick version on the Reagan piece right now. That's a rather shocking shot of Manly P. Hall. Manly P. Hall, let me say a couple of things about him. Absolutely extraordinary and definite mystery school player. Comes out and at the tender age of 28 releases The Secret Teachings of All Ages, which has all these incredible pieces of doctrines and secret things that come out, which he could not have got unless he was close with those groups in the first place. Another strange thing, never made it out of high school, Manly P. Hall. Figure that one out. So whoever was training him, it was on the accelerated program, shall we say. The book is still extraordinary, and it came out in 1928, I believe. So, you know, this is still something which is highly informative and required reading if you want to understand anything about the different mystery schools over the years. Fundamentally, he put theosophy at such a level, saying that they had achieved things on such a level, that he cites it as a real change in the evolution of our spiritual destiny. And I can see it because bringing together all that esoteric knowledge and then that forming into anthroposophy, giving us the Western initiatic Christ tradition on the esoteric side is crucial because, you know, as we know, when theosophy deteriorated, the Eastern initiators and people who wanted to use theosophy just for the independence of India took over. And it became under the, you know, umbrella of all these other forces that were different than what it had started out as. Big surprise. We've seen it a lot. But let me point out a couple of quick things, and we will look at Reagan. But I'm glad that this came up, because when I mentioned that Bannon with Trump, represented the fourth way, and we know he's deep into the fourth way, but he was a very big influence on Trump getting into office in 2016. Whatever else, you have a diverse pool of opinion about Bannon for sure, but this is somebody who's deep on the mystery side. But then there's General Flynn. General Flynn went to, the Church Triumphant in Montana, in Livingston, Montana, right where Casey said, "Someday must feed the world," as I mentioned. And then he gave a speech on his own somewhere else, which was exactly the same speech as Elizabeth Clare Prophet's speech about Archangel Michael. So now we have Flynn deep with Church Universal and Triumphant, Bannon with the fourth way, and on we go. And then we crisscross into Trump and all of his, Norman Vincent Peale and New Thought and all that piece. And then Trump's uncle in the UFO file. So you've got a lot of threads that aren't obvious when it comes to these people coming into position and the things that they do. If we understood their mystery school ties, then it's a different ballgame. Then I think we understand them a lot better. It looks like there are influences that were trying to tap the Trump presidency to go and, on a very mystery track. And I don't, it's hard to say what level they got there. Now, a couple of quick things. Reagan, follower of occult guru Manly P. Hall. Isn't that interesting? Well, let's look at Reagan in the 60s. Who was the person who was calling the shots for Reagan then? Astrologer Carol Ryder. Well, what do we know about Ryder? He was a main player with so many of Hollywood's people, psychic readings, astrological readings, and he became an incredible influence on the Reagans. In fact, they did the insane thing of actually being pictured with them. That's impressive. They didn't get pictured with Manly P, interestingly enough. Ryder has an interesting history, Carl Ryder. He was spotted as talent at 14 years old by Evangeline Adams. And if you know anything about astrology, psychic work, Evangeline Adams was somebody who was a real power player in the 20s and 30s on this. And she wrote all these she did all these astrological readings for Casey and things of this nature.
She was a superstar.
She was, but you know what's interesting?
What?
Guess who her ghostwriter was?
Don't know.
For her books? Aleister Crowley.
Ah.
He was making bank off Evangeline Adams. There's a weird side story about Crowley if you want it. Crowley has this, he had this big image as the, 666, I am the beast. And he did all these things and worked with these groups and covens. But there's a guy, C.S. Knott, who worked with both Gurdjieff and Crowley. And he worked for Crowley in a bookstore, and it was Crowley's bookstore. And he said that Crowley was he was this kind of sympathetic figure who was sort of hanging out in this bookstore, always talking about the big things he wanted to do, but didn't have the money to do them. And it was a very interesting other thing. Well, now we see he's picking up jobs writing for Evangeline Adams and ghostwriting. So, it's interesting to look at these people and the strange ups and downs that they have. Of course, he probably spent all his money on heroin. That was why. Now, when we look at Ryder, we're getting a glimpse there of how deep the Reagans are into this. The Reagans will actually get themselves, give their governor's speech, their acceptance speech, at exactly the time he specifies. And it's something like 12:30 in the morning that he gives the speech for the acceptance of the governorship. So that's the level of power that Ryder had over them. Ryder represents, to me, a deep element in Hollywood that's connected with psychic experience and mystery knowledge. Now, that degree, we have everything on that side, from psychopaths like Hodel and that whole occult black group working there, Man Ray and all the rest, to people working in, higher circles with a higher mind about the whole thing. But whatever it is about Reagan, the thing that he plugged into that becomes his mystery clique has to do with Hollywood, and it has to do with Manly P. Hall. Hall becomes an honorary Mason at the end of his life. They honor him with that for the work that he's done, but he didn't live his life as a Mason, so he doesn't come out of that Masonic tradition. So the question is, what school did Hall come out of? He tells the story in Secret Destiny of America, and Reagan, the way that Reagan got into this, people found that when he was quoting this story, they said, "Where are you getting that story?" And he never would say where it was from. And then it got exposed where it was from, and he was like, "Oh yes, I did get it from Manly P. Hall, and I do consider him, a great philosopher." But in fact, he behind the scenes, if you find the threads, you're going to find Manly P. Hall was another one of these. He was a non-public close friend of the Reagans. Now, here's the story that's told in Secret Destiny of America that influenced Reagan so much to become president. This is why he wanted to be president. As Reagan told it, a mysterious man in a black cloak appeared in the State House in Philadelphia on July 4th, 1776, and exhorted the faltering delegates to sign the Declaration of Independence. Quote, "God has given America to be free," he thundered, before he just as inexplicably disappeared. Reagan used it as the centerpiece of an article about the meaning of Independence Day that he personally penned for Parade magazine in 1981. It also featured largely in his commencement address at Eureka College in 1957. That was his alma mater. So it says that, to be fair, this is interesting. So he says, to become a sort of village idiot on the fringe of the industrial scene, fair game for any demagogue or bigot who wants to stand up in the pulpit or platform and attack us. And what happens is Reagan talks very reverently about this thing that happened, and he goes into the Secret Destiny of America. Now I'm going to read a little tiny bit more about this directly from Manly P. Hall's book, and then we'll take your next question. On July 4, 1776, in the old State House in Philadelphia, a group of patriotic men were gathered for the solemn purpose of proclaiming the liberty of the American colonies. From the letters of Thomas Jefferson, which are preserved in the Library of Congress, I've been able to gather considerable data concerning this portentous session. And it happens just like Reagan says it. According to Jefferson, it was late in the afternoon before the delegates gathered their courage to the sticking point. The talk was about axes, scaffolds, and the gibbet. When suddenly a strong, bold voice sounded, "Gibbet. They may stretch our necks on all the gibbets in the land. They may turn every rock into a scaffold, every tree into a gallows, every home into a grave, and yet the wounds of that parchment can never die. They may pour our blood on 1,000 scaffolds, and yet from every drop that dyes the axes, a new champion of freedom will spring into birth. The British king may not. He may blot out the stars of God from the sky, but he cannot blot out his words written on that parchment there. The works of God may perish, his words never. The words of this declaration will live in the world long after our bones are dust. To the mechanic in his workshop, they will speak hope. To the slave in the mines, freedom. But to the coward kings, those words will speak in tones of warnings they cannot choose but hear. Sign the parchment. Sign it. If the moment the gibbet's rope is around your neck, sign. If the next minute the halls ring with the clash of falling axes, sign. By all your hopes in life or death as men, as husbands, fathers, brothers, sign your names to the parchment or be cursed forever. Sign, and not only for yourselves, but for all the ages, for that parchment will be the textbook of freedom, the Bible of the rights of man forever. Nay, do not start and whisper with surprise. It is truth. Your own heart bears witness to it. God proclaims it. Look at this strange band of exiles and outcasts, the founding fathers, suddenly transformed into a people, a handful of men weak in arms but mighty in faith, may look at your recent achievements, your Bunker Hill, your Lexington, and then tell me, if you can, that God has not given America to be free. It is not given to our poor human intellect to climb to the skies to pierce the counsel of the Almighty One, but methinks I stand among the awful clouds which veil the brightness of Jehovah's throne. And he goes on. But the thrust of the message is there. What's also interesting is he's in an interesting uniform that they're not familiar with, and they were trying to figure out what it was. Interestingly enough, this person was around, and there's another story about a figure meeting with the founding fathers, and that takes place in Cambridge, about 5 minutes from here. And what they note about this figure is the same type of uniform and stuff, but that he has a very interesting diet, and he doesn't seem to sleep. So there's definitely a lot of mystery influence left over there. But I think Manly P communicating the story through the secret teachings of all agents, and then Reagan picking up on it, understanding that this is the core of the mystery school, moving America as a force in the world, as a mystical center. That's the shining city on the hill that Reagan is getting to in all speeches. Miss Olivia, 2 more questions and we're out.
So Steiner to God, DJ, what do you think of Count Saint Germain? Do you believe he still walks the earth? Do you believe he appeared to Godfrey Ray King at Mount Shasta?
Well, I think Saint Germain is an ascended master, and he is part of the Great White Brotherhood. So you'll find that in the Casey literature, they refer to him. In Blavatsky's work, in Steiner's work, he's there in that mystery school thread. There's also a lot of, there's always like some kind of poser thing about Saint Germain as well. And so you're always going to get a lot of stories that don't have anything to do with Saint Germain. But Saint Germain is someone who achieved a very high level as an initiate, and then was able to project himself. And this is the story of so many of these mystery initiates. When they get to a certain level, supposedly they're able to take up their body when they want it. And, so they reach a kind of level of density where they can come back here and help. So, but I think the stories of Saint Germain are fascinating. And, he has a very contemporary story with Casanova, giving a whole thing about, Casanova is actually like jealous of all the attention that he's getting, and writes about him. It's like, this guy off the charts. So he gives a kind of a lifetime thing about Saint Germain. So there's a few characters like that. Cagliostro is another one in history, but the stories are fascinating. Absolutely. Yes.
Last question.
Sure.
Okay. David Donaway, does a mystery school run, quote, one nation under blackmail? Well, I would think that the the thrust of the mystery schools would be against that. I think there's a huge battle in the mystery schools against the power zone and the secret society aspect, which is throughout the American political system. Remember, Steiner said that when Blavatsky encountered the American mystery schools, they had already basically taken over the entire political process. And they were both right-hand schools and left-hand schools. So you've got that mix going on. There's no doubt about it. The question is, they're all using the mysticism. So the point is, what are they using it for? That's how you identify them. And so there's no question the political process degrades into certain levels of blackmail. And there's major
secret societies behind that political process. Absolutely fascinating. I will share, since we talked about Great American Hero.
Okay.
I'll share it. Now, do you remember the story of Greatest American Hero? Do you remember the thrust of it? Do you remember the theme song?
I remember the theme song well.
All right. So this is a series from 1981, and it premieres March 18th. That is 12 days actually before Reagan is shot by John Hinckley Jr. Now, there's a reason I'm bringing this up, and there's also a little levity in this, but it's a weird story. So Ronald Reagan gets into office. Now, here's an interesting thing. When he is running and he's doing really well, they try to put Ford, the former president who lost to Carter, on his ticket, and he's going for it. And then at a certain point, Ford says, I'm going to be a co-president. It was always weird. There's a thing about David Rockefeller coming in and trying to control this process. So at first, he was trying to get Ford on the ticket, which is a weird thing to do, to make Ford a vice president after he was just Nixon's vice president and then took over and then was beaten by Carter. So there was that weirdness. So then Reagan dumps him from the ticket. Then the meeting with Rockefeller occurs and Bush gets magically on the ticket. Now, Bush had said about Reagan that his work was absolutely, his program was voodoo economics. So it was pretty vicious dialogue. So the idea that this guy was going to be on his ticket was really kind of ridiculous. But nonetheless, it happened. And what they said was that Reagan didn't have a whole lot of respect for Bush and sort of took him on the advice that the Republican establishment wants him, you better do this. So as time went on with this, very shortly into the administration, a weird thing happened, which is there was an assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan. Now, Reagan also had some very interesting ideas. He wanted to investigate going back on a gold standard. He actually had Ron Paul come into his office and talk about these things. And can you imagine having Ron Paul as somebody, you know, who was going to give you advice about getting rid of the Federal Reserve and going back to a gold standard? I think that as much as they wanted to control Reagan, he scared the Jesus out of them. And they decided, we're going to get rid of this guy. And they almost did. Now, they had someone set up there who was John Hinckley Jr. And we know that John Hinckley Jr. recently was let out. And he's got like some music that he does. And he was going to do some shows. And then there was a scandal about it and he couldn't do them. And that was John Hinckley Jr., who claimed that he shot Reagan to impress Jodie Foster. That was the statement. But in fact, there were MK Ultra traces all over him, including the fact that he was part of the World Vision Church, which is also the same church that Mark David Chapman, who shot John Lennon, was from. These guys were set up as assassins. And it's very interesting when we get around Hinckley, because his parents were close to Bush, the whole family. So it was a very obvious crossover and a very interesting thing to use somebody who was close to the Bushes. And in fact, you know, the crossover there was so intense that it was reported even by NBC News and that lot, that this is a weird, you know, this is a strange combination. Now, I'm going to do this part about the Greatest American Hero. This is the show. And remember, it's all about this character who, through, you know, these aliens, gets these superpowers. And what he's involved in with this little FBI guy, Robert Culp, is he is trying to thwart a presidential takeover by the vice president over the president. Now, interestingly enough, the name of the Greatest American Hero was Ralph Hinckley. Now, he's the superhero protagonist in the TV series, The Greatest American Hero. Hinckley has an encounter with aliens who provide him with a special suit and give him superpowers. Unfortunately, he's lost the instruction manual. The specifics of Hinckley's childhood remain unrevealed. What is known is that he became a substitute special ed teacher in LA. While returning at night from a field trip with his students, his bus breaks down in the middle of the desert. He's almost struck by a car belonging to FBI agent Bill Maxwell, portrayed by Robert Culp. Two mysterious UFOs show up, leaving Maxwell and Ralph locked in the vehicle. Flying saucer approaches and hovers in front of them. Now, in 12 days after the show premieres, John Hinckley Jr. will shoot Ronald Reagan. Now, the idea that the names are exactly the same, the last name is Hinckley, and that there's a UFO aspect going on, and that the thrust of the early episodes of the show have this whole thing about this coup that's taking place and the vice president being involved, are just remarkable when you think about the conditions of when Reagan is shot. Actually, Bush is in the air, so they, kind of clears him from anything. And also that Alexander Haig says, I'm in control, So there's a weird whole strangeness just about the happenstance, shall we say, of this taking place. If you go a little bit deeper into it, the story gets even more bizarre. But that, that's definitely the thrust of it. The only other thing I can say about it is that Hinckley, there's a Mae Brussel piece about Hinckley where she talks about Hinckley showing up at her house before he shoots Reagan, and that he made this trip out to California, and that somebody fitting his description and the description of his car sits outside her house for 3 hours playing music. So obviously there's, she's the person who was very deep in the assassination research of JFK and RFK. And then this guy shows up who's about to shoot Reagan. Now, here's what's interesting also, which is he was around and he was caught with firearms in Tennessee at a Carter campaign rally in 1980, and they let him go. And also his parents, the Hinckley, that whole family actually comes from Dallas. And they moved to Colorado because there were such oil bigwigs. And they had made so much money in oil that they became big donors to the Bush family.
Wait a second. So if they were from Dallas and they were elites in Dallas related to the money, I mean, they must have been friendly with the people behind
DeMore and Schultz and all those.
Yes.
Absolutely. Well, I'll just read you one quote from them in relation to this, because the Bushes do an interesting job of saying, yeah, we know them, but it doesn't mean anything. And by the way, that's the UFO shot from the TV series. Make no mistake about it. And again, here is Reagan surrounded by the Bushes. Remember, if Reagan goes, these people all benefit dramatically. And two of them, in fact, will become president. So, I mean, the fact that Hinckley knows them is significant. The greatest American hero, that might be happenstance, but whoa. All right. So here's an interesting thing. Why was Ralph's name bleeped out? Because 2 days before the episode aired, it was 2 days. On March 30th, 1981, President Ronald Reagan was nearly assassinated in front of the Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C. by John W. Hinckley Jr. The assassination attempt was upsetting enough since Reagan had only been in office for less than 70 days. When John Hinckley's motive for shooting the president was revealed, that he was a deranged fan of Jodie Foster, supposedly they went into this whole thing about, we have to change, we have to bleep out his name. So every time they went to say his name, Hinckley, you'd hear like a truck go by, or you'd hear some sound that would distract you from it. Okay. Another weird thing I noticed, just because I was on a little bit of a tear with this. So let's have some fun here at the end. Are you ready? So the two people who were up for the roles, and I confirm this now through the actual scriptwriters, if you go to their site, the two people who were up for the roles of Princess Leia and Luke Skywalker were actually Jodie Foster, who was going to be Princess Leia. That was one. and our friend William Catt, who plays the greatest American hero. So that's just pretty interesting. And when I think about that, you think about the coincidence of that, considering he's going to use Jodie Foster as the reason. Oh, it's pretty good. Maybe that whole, I'm going to give you flash forwards here at the end of the episode. Those are all different Masons. And this is actually, let's not forget, Masons on the Moon, Buzz Aldrin, and his very special thing that he placed there on the moon for the Masons. All very, very interesting. And let's see if I have any last little details for you. Finally, I think that's it on Hinckley, but, oh, by the way, that's interesting. It's the little thing that was deposited on the moon, which had all these statements from Nixon and Queen Elizabeth and all the rest. Just this little kind of chip that was left up there. I would love to see what the contents of that chip. Another Mason who was assassinated in office, William McKinley, on the way out. And let's see. I think with that, Miss Olivia, we're done.
I wanted to end with this one question,
Yes.
which I unfortunately deleted, so I don't remember who asked it. But if somebody wanted to get started with a book on the mystery schools, what would you recommend?
I think Knowledge of Higher Worlds by Steiner is good, like the fundamental instruction book. And I would say beyond that, that In Search of the Miraculous is the whole story of the Gurdjieff mystery schools and how Ouspensky got involved with it. In addition to that, I think that the any Casey biography or Casey on Atlantis also starts to give you a piece of that. And then probably any of the, I think Blavatsky's books, the Secret Doctrine book, it's heavy, but it's worthwhile, extremely worthwhile. But I think I'd start with the, it's a great book to open this up with is Cosmic Memory. And I say that with a lot of bias because it's something, that when I first read made an incredible impression on me. Oh, I'm going to end the episode with a Casey quote. Are you ready? You have to say you're ready.
I'm ready.
All right. All right. Talking about America, but also predictions. Here we go. As to conditions in the geography of the world, of the country, changes here are gradually coming about. No wonder then that the entity feels the necessity for a change of central location, for many portions of the East Coast will be disturbed, as well as many portions of the West Coast, as well as the central portion of the United States. Land will appear in the Atlantic. Remember, land rising? Land's going to appear in the Atlantic, as well as in the Pacific. And what is the coastline now of many a field will be the bed of ocean. Even many of the battlefields of the present World War II will be ocean, will be seas, the bays and lands over which the new group will carry their trade as one with another. Portion of the now east coast of New York or New York City itself will in the main disappear. Think about that one. This will be another generation, though, here, while the southern portions of Carolina, Georgia, these will be much sooner. These will disappear. So the earth changes that are coming is something that the mystery schools have given us information through the work of Edgar Casey and others. That also could be something that these people see coming and want to get ahead of, because when all the earth changes take place, they still want to be the big cheese.
I just had a huge insight.
Yes.
Share.
Oh, yeah.
So let me see if I can communicate it. It was like a download. The guide said everybody here who's watching the show, we all want things to change, and we're struggling against a sense of powerlessness and feeling like there are certain powerful beings on this planet who don't have our best interests at heart and wondering what to do about it. That's what the nature of this show is actually about, is talking about that topic.
Oh, yeah.
The guides just told me that basically once we take them, as in the guides, our own guides and angels, more seriously than we take the quote elites of this world, that is when things are going to change. They need to become more real to us than our fear over these humans, these
Interesting. Absolutely.
parasites.
That could be straight out of a Steiner lecture.
I knew it was true as soon as I received it. It was just incredibly profound.
Very, very interesting. Making it real. Absolutely. Wow. Incredible. And with that, Miss Olivia, we're
I have
done.
a bunch of people to thank. Okay. Whew. Sorry, I'm charged up with spiritual
That was
life.
great.
Gil and Joy R, a cult fan, Chris Joseph, Daryl Roberts, Freya Anderson, Jim Sarge 3ID, Kevin Kelso, Bill Mayo, Clifton, oh God, Dulfer, another language, Mr. Wolf, Karen Carpenter, W.C. Ray, Thomas Tyson, Dorian Hewitt, James Bodie, Eurythmia's Fun, Bob Smith, Undestroyer, Sun Hero, Atlantis is Found, Systematically Discombobulated, Melody Lenz, Bob Smith, Lance Boivin, YouTuber 427, Trident Vibes, Bob Bindert, Mike A, Page Wizards, and Dude Abides. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Unbelievable. Thank you so much for your support. It makes a huge difference in the work we're trying to bring to you. And reports like these, we will be back with you next week. We have some exciting interviews coming up for you also, and special reports. And I'm going to do a couple of shout outs here. And let's see if I can get that going. I literally did a reading to connect with a man with his archangel. Interesting. Huh. Fascinating. I like this. Project Redfoot. Fun times. Sometimes it's the tight quote that makes it. That's the one. The Dude Abides. Michael Watson. Excellent. Golden Girl. Deborah Sloan. Timothy Guessing. Keep the Faith. I like that. Don New Way. Very interesting. I agree. Very, very interesting. Love is everlasting, says. Oh, I lost it. Somewhere it was in there. It was a good quote. Gypsy Moon, Nick Malone, Luke Walker. Truly fantastic show. Thank you very much. It was great to have so many great questions from the Ideas Room. And one thing I will tell you is we're looking forward to seeing you all for the 5th anniversary of the X series in the middle of March. And that's going to be a very special 2-parter. So put something special together for you. Just wait till you see what I have going there. Me on TV, Nothing Is As It Seems, Brad Briggs, Renee Newton, We Are the Way. I like that. We Are the World. That was the one. Great show. Sundari Bliss. Thank you. Yes.
Karen Carpenter was also asking about what documentaries or movies could be watched. And of course, I answered Meetings with Remarkable Men, which I think is free on YouTube, isn't it?
Well, you might have to get it, but it's worth it.
It's outstanding.
Yeah. Gypsy Moon, Trident Vibes. Excellent. Olivia Wings Girl, there you go. Caritas Tarot. What you said about connecting with angels really resonates with me, Olivia. Thank you for that. My heart is fluttering. It's not nice. Fantastic. Mary Maria. Fantastic. Thank you very much for being with us. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Najat Madri. Najat, it's great to see you. DJ Beto. Autek. Heyo. Fantastic. We will see you all next week. Maggie Ray. I sleep so well every Friday night after your show. As long as you don't sleep during the show, that's all that counts. Trident Vibes. You the man. My heart is fluttering too. That's great. Golden Girl. Fantastic. What a great crowd out there tonight. We will see you all next week. And, it says end broadcast after all, but it never really ends. And when people tell you that the presidential election doesn't matter in 2024, tell them that DJ said they're wrong. And I think we can prove it with the mystery schools. And let's give the mystery schools some better options. We'll see you all next week.
God bless.
Thank you, Miss Olivia. Bravo. Nicely done. I agree, Don Neway. Michael Watson, DJ for president. Well, isn't that interesting? Wait, we have to wait till New Atlantis for that one. We'll get that going.
You would love to run. I know you.
Have a great night, everyone.